Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to the Noahide Path with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Today he'll be speaking about the early history of the Chassidic movement. Real exciting topic. A few of us in the Zoom meeting have sat through a couple of the sessions already, and very, very informative material. The rabbi does want to encourage people to come into the Zoom room. We've been in there for a half an hour chatting. It's always good to interact, get to know one another, and we've got several in there. So I have posted the Zoom links on all the Facebook ads, along with the YouTube ads. So feel free to watch it on the social media channels if you like. But the rabbi is encouraging people to come into the Zoom room. The whole point is to answer your questions in a more efficient manner and have a more interactive group. It does work. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to what's going on in the Zoom room, and the rabbi will probably start in the next couple of minutes.
This is what we got going on. We got people robbing cops, federal agents, anybody that's out there. Now, some people are fortunate enough where they can get the ups on the guy. And I do remember someone tried to, carjack me one day. And the only thing that saved me was I slapped the gun out of the guy's head. But that doesn't help everybody. Sometimes if you do that, you get shot. Okay. So there you go.
At the beginning, obviously, you probably have a problem. But if you go to states which have a tradition of people having concealed carry, they just end up being, much less problems with things like that. The statistics are out. You can look at them and find what it is. It's a different. I'm not saying, but okay, then we should.
We're discussing halakha now.
We should go back to that issue. Now, as far as it's concerned, by the way, as far as Noahide laws is concerned, a Noahide is allowed to protect themselves. So if you are in danger, somebody attacks you, then you are allowed to protect yourself. I believe you're supposed to actually try and wound them if you can, but it's not very easy. All these movies have the guys, shooting the guy in the hand and shooting his gun out of his hand. It's not very easy to do that. It really isn't. You have to protect your life, obviously.
So Noahides don't have to turn the other cheek, right?
No, I mean, you're allowed to save your own life. I mean, you're not allowed to, the prohibition, we'll get up and discuss about the laws more specifically there and some of the details as far as this, but the prohibition is about murder, just like the Torah. The prohibition is about murder. It's not about taking a life when there's a legitimate reason for it. Okay, death penalty is taking a life, but it's not murder because that's the punishment for having violations. Okay, if somebody's trying to kill you and you protect yourself, that's not murder. It's justifiable if it's within the halachic boundaries, for example. This is discussed in the Talmud, the Tractate Marcus. We'll talk about it. Not specifically.
So even in there, is there a provision for defending your family and all that stuff?
Yeah, essentially. We'll discuss this when we get to it. When we deal with religion, theology and Noahide is going to deal with the first two mitzvahs, dealing with God, and we'll talk about a bunch of theological things, implications from that. And religion, Noahide is going to deal with the other 5 mitzvahs, and we're going to discuss about them also. What religion is for Noahide, the mitzvahs, those other things like honoring your parents. What does it mean to honor your parents, for example? There's an obligation in all the sources that says that things like there's an obligation to honor your parents. What does it mean for Noahide to honor your parents? Okay. So that kind of thing. We will get to everything in my usual type of discussion. Totally unique, unprecedented, and things that you haven't heard before. And we'll deal with that. Okay, let me turn on the recording because it's already recording somewhere else.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so anyways, those of you who weren't on the Zoom session, you probably missed out of some nice discussion that we had here. So I would like to encourage any of you who can try and come to the Zoom sessions, because we really do sit down and talk over a lot of different things that you don't necessarily hear when we are, sending it out to everybody. Now, this is the second session of this subunit on rabbis and Noahides. Here we're talking about the Chassidic movement. Again, I will reiterate what I said before. The reason why we are doing this is that invariably, as a Noahide, you are coming in contact with a lot of people who are Chassidic. And the Chassidic movement is somewhat of a strange thing to Noahides. They have only they interact with either some from Chabad, sometimes from Breslov, and very, very rarely from somebody outside of those two groups. So what I was trying to do last time, I talked about some differences between the different groups, things that differentiate them, like how they look at their rebbes, their view towards modernity. The view towards modernity is extremely important to know for Noahides, because when if you want to interact with Hasidim and like that, you have to understand that the view of modernity, the view of the modern world, the secular world, the non-Jewish world, will very much color the way that they will react to you, and how they're going to react to you, how they're going to look at things that you do. So, for example, the overwhelming majority of the Hasidic world, as with the Haredi world, are anti-modernity. It's not just they have a neutrality to it; they're anti-modernity. They don't want anything to do with the modern world. There are various prohibitions, the internet, smartphones, all kinds of things. If you go into the communities, they're totally against it. The Chassidic communities, the more religious communities. Okay, so that's important to understand, because that does reflect on the type of reactions you would get if you want to interact with the Hasidic world. They will, in general, look very much at the outside world at all in a very negative way, and as such, they will look at any non-Jew. They'll consider any non-Jew as being a Christian if they're in America or whatever they're in other country, unless proven otherwise. Okay. Now Chabad is different because of different things, and we're going to talk about some of that came up already. Breslov is the same way, except there are some, because Breslov doesn't have the type of social structure there that other groups have. You will have some Breslovers doing things that in general is not in accord with what Breslovers do in general. We'll talk a little bit about that. We can ask questions and discuss what it is. In general, the Chassidic world, so for example, in the world that I live in, we are against internet, we're against smartphones and businesses, they're little about that, but and a view of modernity is a problem. So truthfully, I think that of the Noahides that I know in the world today, 90 to 95% of those, if they ever walked into a community like mine, would be looked at very, very suspiciously in the way that they act, the way that they talk, what they say they do, and stuff like that. They would be looked at very suspiciously. Okay, and this is just because of many things. I mean, one of the purposes of the Noahide path and what I've been trying to teach, which a lot of people, many rabbis I do actually agree with what I'm trying to do and understand what I'm trying to do, is to actually educate Noahides, not so much about the legal aspects where there are going to be some difference between what I say and others, but the actual outlook. Because Noahides come from a Christian world, they have a Christian paradigm of how they look at things, whether it be the Tanakh or anything like that. The point of here, what I'm trying to is get you away from that paradigm to understand that's not what it is. Let me teach you the Torah paradigm, and then we'll fit you in as a Noahide, how you fit into it, and understand what the difference is. This is going to start becoming much more clear. I've talked about it, but it's become much more clear in the next unit we're going to have, which is going to be Noahides and the Tanakh. Tanakh being the Jewish Bible. Okay, and there we're going to see really in a practical level where the difference is of the paradigm from in the Christian world it came from, what the paradigm is in the Torah world, according to the Torah, what the Torah says. Okay, that's very important, because the way Jews look at the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is totally different from the way evangelical Christians, Torah observant Christians, totally different from that. And once you see that kind of a difference, it may help you to understand a lot of things, and may help you also understand why there is, at the moment, going to be a lot of lack of acceptance of Noahides. Even those of you who are very sincere, what is a barrier to the general Jewish world, except for those places like Chabad, which are very, very welcoming of everybody. Okay, so it's very important to know that, because for you, it's going to help you a lot in the future. However you do, but at least it'll help you a lot in the future. Okay, that's basically what we're trying to do. So now we're discussing the Chassidic world, because that is a large part of the world, the Jewish world in general, and specifically when it comes to deal with Noahides, the fact of the matter is is that Chabad is the most welcoming of Noahides in the world. And, they try and teach something like that. The Rebbe told them to do such things. So they're also the most modern of the Chassidic groups in the sense that rather than they're rejecting modernity of the world, or at the most, accepting it in a way that, okay, it's necessary evil for certain things. And the obviously embrace the modern world and modern things like internet and stuff like that, which in other places totally. That's why you don't really find somebody from Hasidic places really spreading things here. I mean, you might see clips from different rabbis and stuff like that, but you don't really see any, real, people, very much people here. The people you hear that are Hasidic, except for me and maybe a couple other people, I'm basically here because they're somewhat rebelling against their communities. Okay, so in the last time we talked about some differences. Now what I want to do is, okay, we have today a bunch of Hasidic groups. Some of them you heard of, Breslov, I know you've heard of, and Chabad you've heard of. Some other ones that are large you might have heard. You might have heard of Satmar, for example. You might have heard of Ger, which is very large in Israel. Okay, so you might have heard of some of these groups, but the question in your mind is obviously, what is the difference between them? Where they come? What makes them different one from the other? And Chabad is very simple to point out the difference. What's the difference between Satmar and Ger, for example? Two mega Hasidic groups that have hundreds of thousands of families. Okay, where do they, where do they come to it? And the best approach, before I deal with the individual groups that you have, those that are considered large size or mega Hasidic groups, where they come into, the best way of doing it is basically to look at how the first three generations of the Hasidic movement actually developed. Okay, I'm sure most of you heard that the founder was called the Baal Shem Tov, Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. He lived in the city of Mezbez, which is in the Ukraine. The Hasidic movement started in the Ukraine. And if you look at a map of Ukraine and you look at some of these cities that get mentioned, you can see on a map of Ukraine where these cities actually are. A lot of them are in the western part of the Ukraine, not the eastern part, mostly in the western part of Ukraine. But you find in very, very big cities like Zlotcha and stuff like that. You'll actually find it on a map of the Ukraine. Chernobyl, for example, with the nuclear disaster occurred, Chernobyl was a very big center of the Hasidic movement in the Ukraine. And we'll get to that, shortly. Okay, so that's where it started. So the founder was Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. He lived in the city of Mezbez. Scholars have found documentation mentioning him as being a Baal Shem in the city of Mezbez. A Baal Shem was somebody who was basically a miracle worker. You went to him if you were sick, and he was able to give blessings to heal you, or certain things to heal you. He has prayers. He was considered a holy man. This is something in Jewish tradition we have. He was not the first one. There's a very famous one from in Germany, the Baal Shem of Mechelstadt, but there's been others. These were primarily people who came out of the Kabbalistic movements that were going at the time, and because of their lives of purity and separation from the world, they reached very high levels of holiness. The Baal Shem Tov was one of those. Baal Shem Tov means a good Baal Shem. Okay, so he that was what he was. He was a personality. We actually have some historical stuff about him now. That he was in that city, and he comes from a certain tradition that was there. There were before his time many groups, chaburas, groups of people, of Kabbalists who would come together. I mentioned once in the city of Brod, but there are many of them, many different groups where there were Kabbalists, and people came around these people, and there were small groups. About Shem Tov, what made a difference is that his group spread out. And we're going to talk about how it spread out. But it started with him and his Talmidim and people in his city and around there were influenced by him. Okay, now he lived in the 18th century, middle of the 18th century. I believe that during his time, there was a lot of changes in the political situation. I believe he died before the partition of Poland, but certainly afterwards, Poland was partitioned, and the first generations of the Chassidic movement actually existed after the partition of Poland between Russia and Austro-Hungarian Empire. And also Germany took part of it also, but that area was not very conducive to the Chassidic movement. Areas under Russia and Austro-Hungary were. So the Baal Shem Tov, let's deal first with his family, and then we'll deal with him. Now, what I'm going to, I cannot deal with every single person, every personality, even many of the important ones that in my mind, it was very important, who came with important books and stuff like that. I will just deal with the ones that are of such a level that their impact on the Hasidic movement, or they wrote works which were so important that they're considered universal, meaning that everybody across the spectrum of the Hasidic community, with the exclusion of Chabad, which we'll get to why that's different, and possibly in Breslov, they don't really look too much outside of what Malcolm taught. So except for that, in the general Hasidic world, which we're talking about 90+% of the Hasidic world, these are works that are accepted throughout the whole world. Okay, so it's important to recognize that. Now, again, if you're only familiar with Chabad, many of these things will not have heard, because Chabad has its own little niche and doing certain things. So it leaves out quite a bit of stuff that the Baal Shem Tov taught that the rest of the Hasidic world picked up on. Okay, so the Baal Shem Tov had a son, Tzvi, who didn't really become a Rebbe afterwards. He didn't really have a group around him. It seems he had a small group, and the Baal Shem Tov did have a number of descendants, grandchildren, stuff like that, who, very, very small groups, but they really did not have a significant influence in the later movement. Okay. However, his daughter Udo had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and through them, these 3 had a very significant influence on the Chassidic movement in the future. Okay. The first one and the oldest one was Moshe Chaim Ephraim from the city of Sedlkov. The Baal Shem Tov himself mentions this grandson in a famous letter of his to his brother-in-law Gershon Kittov in Eretz Yisrael. And he mentions his grandson, Moshe Chaim Ephraim, and how he was already bar mitzvah, and how he was very, in learning Torah, he was very raised. Okay, so he's already mentioned by the Baal Shem Tov, meaning that, we have, from the Baal Shem Tov himself, that he had a relationship with this grandson. Now, this Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sedlkov, he did not set up a Hasidic dynasty. So we don't have people who are descendants of people who have this. However, what we do have from him is a sefer called Degel Machne Ephraim, which is a collection of his teachings. Now, this is, I would say, we could say this is one of the 2 or 3 most important works from the Talmidim for the Baal Shem Tov on the Torah from the Baal Shem Tov. Okay? In the Degel Machne Ephraim, he numerous times relates things that he heard directly from his grandfather. You will see in there a number of places, and the copy that I have actually puts it in block, bold characters, where he says, I heard from my grandfather, or, and he says, my grandfather, and this is what I heard him say, and then he'll explain what is the meaning of what his grandfather said. Okay? This is one of the fundamental works on the Torah from the Baal Shem Tov. We know it from the works from this. Okay? Everything else is usually through other things, whatever. But this is purely what the Baal Shem Tov, when he says this is what the Baal Shem Tov. There's another work we're going to get into soon, also, which is very similar to that. Okay? Now, he had a brother who was actually a bigger Rebbe than him, Reb Bura, who lived in Mezbis. He was very big. He was very influential. Many of the other Rebbes that lived in his time, he was a grandson, so he lived like the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. Died sometime, I believe, in the early 1800s, if I remember correctly. Okay, he had a lot of influence on many groups, especially in Ukraine and in Russia itself. They revere him and had a lot of interaction with him. In some ways, he was considered as the inheritor of the Baal Shem Tov. He certainly considered himself the inheritor from the Baal Shem Tov, being his grandson, and following in the derech that he learned from the Baal Shem Tov. And the city of Mezbis, because that's where the Baal Shem Tov was buried, many of the Talmidim would go to the Rebbe's where he's buried in Mezbis and to pray there. So in that house, he lived in the actual house of the Baal Shem Tov. In that house, you would have many of the Talmidim from the Baal Shem Tov. Ministers of the Baal Shem Tov would come there and they would talk about the Baal Shem Tov until he was raised in an atmosphere of the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, what the Baal Shem Tov taught. And as such, he's very great. There's a cipher that was collected. You have to understand that most Rebbes did not write Sforim. They were people who collected what they taught and put it. So there's a cipher from him, B'tzin Dahida, which he didn't say. He said it, but it's not, he didn't write it. It was things collected that he said that they put into a book. Okay, so that's a book. The next one is a daughter, Fega, and she married Simcha Parshas Simcha was a daughter of Nachman Hardenko. I'll mention Nachman Hardenko soon because he's important in his own right. And they had a son that Nachman named after his grandfather. And this is the famous Nachman of Breslov. Nachman was raised with his uncle, Rabbi, in the same city of Mizbos, in the house of his great-grandfather. He also grew up among many of the Talmidim for the Baal Shem Tov. So we're going to see soon that the author told the Yaakov Yosef used to be there. All of these people, he grew up among Talmidim for the Baal Shem Tov. He was steeped, steeped in the teaching for the Baal Shem Tov, what the Baal Shem Tov directly taught. Okay, now he wrote a work, Likutei Maharan. It's somewhat unique in its own way. The approbations of that book read from basically the greatest Chassidic rabbis in his time, in the early 1800s. Number of them. Some of them will actually be mentioned later. I'm not going to mention them now, but that was a fundamental place. When Reb Nachman died, he had his main Talmud was Nussen and Nimirov, and Reb Nachman indicated that he would be the last Rebbe. And after them, they would still follow him his Torahs forever. So in Breslov, Reb Nussen followed. Reb Nussen wrote a work of Kutei Haluchos and other things, but all of it is basically a commentary of what Reb Nachman wrote. It was not individual new ideas. It's all based as commentary trying to explain what Reb Nachman taught. So Kutei Haluchos is by Reb Nussen, and every single teaching he has there is based on one of the Torahs from the Reb Nachman, or part of it a little bit, in which he elucidates all kinds of things from it, in Kabbalah and stuff like that, all kinds of things from it. And that's what's Kutei Haluchos. It's an extension of that. And until this day, that is basically what the derech is in Breslov. There are a lot of different groups, a lot of different leaders. I don't know what they call them, like Mishpiyim. So in Jerusalem today, there's an old Breslov Chassid. He's in his 90s now. His name is Yaakov Shechter, and he's the head of the Breslov Chassidim Yerushalayim. And so you'll get, they sometimes give out pamphlets of his teaching. Every single thing he teaches is based on what either Reb Nachman said or something that Nussen said in explaining Reb Nachman. Everything is all what Nachman taught, nothing besides that. So in Breslov, their teachings, as it says, are basically from Reb Nachman, Likutei Maharan. Okay? So when I say something is a universal thing, they may not know it. I think Daigle they may know. And told the Yaakov Yosef they may look at also because of the being from that generation. But things in later generations, they don't really learn that. It's not part of their way of understanding Chassidus. The way of understanding is purely directly from Reb Nachman, who was a great grandson of Baal Shem Tov, who was raised in a place where the Baal Shem Tov himself went. Okay, now the Sefer, I should say, Likutei Maharan, is also not learned outside very much of Breslov. But there are people who learned it. I learned it. I had a Rebbe who learned it. A lot of people learn it. Why? Because it's very, very interesting. It's a little bit strange. You have to get used to it, but it's very difficult. It's all from beginning to end. It's all Kabbalistic ideas. And if you're not really familiar with Kabbalah, you're not really understanding what he's saying. And they explain a certain thing, whatever. That's really not the point. The point is that that's what Breslov goes according to that. Now today, what it is Breslov is sort of interesting. Today they have Breslov that many of the people belong to groups. So you can follow Yaakov Shechter. There's a Kramer. There's a Kluger. There's a few other people who have groups around them that they're basically the teacher of those groups, and they follow them. And they basically will be not much different than me as far as their view of modernity, view of the outside world. Okay, they're pretty much the same as all the other Chassidim would be. Okay, but there are some people who read Reb Nachman's works and they consider, I read it and I like it, so I'm a Breslover because of that. They're not really Breslovers because they don't really belong to the tradition. They haven't gotten the tradition of Breslov from one generation to another differently. For example, the third generation Breslov, Nachman from Charn. He came up with a couple of interesting works, and he was very known for his commentaries on the Nachman. These are traditions from people from generation to generation. There was a tradition in Breslov from generation going down to the present day. So if you speak to somebody, this particular person who's a Mishpiyah said his teacher was this person, whose teacher was this, all the way back to the Nussen. And from this, and it goes to the Nachman. Okay, but there's a lot of people who aren't part of that tradition. So you will see many of the people who will come onto the internet now. If you speak to them, they really are not really an integral part of that tradition, because otherwise they wouldn't be on the internet at all. But it's a little bit, a little bit more free flowing like that. It's not, like that. But they basically, if you go to most of the places, my Shechner's people, they will prohibit internet and smartphones and the whole thing like that. No different than any other from the Chassidim. Okay, so that's about Shem Tov's family. Again, we have enormous influence from the children from his daughter, and the grandchildren. The Nachman's a grandchild, obviously. Enormous influence on the beginning of the Chassidic movement, and many other Chassidic groups in that time. It's very important to recognize that. Okay, because when the Baal Shem Tov died, his main Talmud, as far as the one who is really responsible for the spreading out of the Chassidic movement throughout Eastern Europe into other areas outside of that small area of Ukraine. If it wasn't for him, this is the Rabbi from Mezich. If it wasn't for him, Hasidus would have been just a small movement in the Ukraine, and it maybe even would have died out after a number of years. Okay, but the Rabbi of Mezich, and we'll discuss it later in the second part of here, sent out students to different places of Eastern Europe, and that's how it spread all over. Okay, now Dov Berfman, like all the other early rabbis, didn't write anything himself. However, he had Talmidim who gathered his teachings and put them together into books. Now, there are a lot of them around now, but there were 3 that were written in the early years from people who were from his direct Talmidim. I mean, they heard directly from him, who wrote down what they heard directly from him into Sfura. There's 3 of them, and these are fundamentally the most important ones. So later collections that we have, I have a cipher called Torahs and Magids, 2 volumes, and what the person there did is he took from these, put them together according to the weekly parshas, according to Yom Tovim. So it's easier to look up things there, but essentially it's taken from these things, and then there's some other works from other Talmidim that might not have been here that they take from there. Sometimes it's the same Torah in a number of places. If you look into that work, you'll see a teaching there, and it'll say, it lists all 3 of these works, because it was written, all 3 of these works were just written by 3 different people. It's rare, but that happens. I know of one other book that Ohev Yisrael, there's another Talmud of his who wrote, and the things appear sometimes in both places. Sometimes they don't appear in all places. The first one is the most important one. It's called Magid Devut of Yankov. He related his words to Jacob. It's also better known under the name Likutei Amorim, the collected words, the collected speeches. Now, the author, the writer, it's very hard to call him the author. The one is the transcriber, the editor of this, was Shulman of Lutz. He was a Talmud from the Rebbe Ber. We're going to talk about him later because he is important from himself alone. So that's the first one, the most important one, the one that most people learn. So if somebody wants to learn the original from the Ber from Mezich, the Maggid Mezich, he will look at that. However, there are 2 other ones that are also very important. The second one's called Or Torah, and this was written by Yeshaya of Dinovitz. Dinovitz is a city also in Ukraine, whatever. And he wrote in the Torahs from Rebbe Ber that he heard when he was in Mezich. Many of these are going to be similar to the other ones. This is basically, he was a Rebbe himself. He was a tzaddik, and he had some followers. But basically, he's not so important that we'll mention here. So this is the only mention you have. The third one is a work called Or HaEmes, and that was written down from what Levi Yitzchak Badisha, the very famous Levi Yitzchak Badisha, what he heard when he was in Mezich. Okay, a third cipher itself, basically what he heard in Mezich. This is very important because Levi Yitzchak was one of the biggest of the students of the Maggid, and his name, the Badisha, is a name that's pretty well known. Even in Lubavitch, they revere him as a great person, even though he didn't follow the Chabad Derech, but he's revered in Lubavitch also. The late Lubavitch Rebbe, his father's name was Levi Yitzchak, probably named after him. Okay, so that's the 3 books, the 3 form that exist. Again, none of those are written from the Maggid himself. They're written from his Talmidim. Now, the family of the Maggid is also very important because it leads to a number of significant Hasidic dynasties that were originally in Ukraine area, but also eventually moved to Romania and that area around there, spread out in that area. Okay, so one of the son of the Maggid was called Avram. He's called Hamalach, the angel, because of his living a life of separation from the world. He unusually, in general, Hasidim do not fast or stuff like that. They minimize something, but he was known for fasting. He was known for all kinds of strictness in his way of life. He was basically separated from the world totally. There's many stories of that. Interesting enough, when the Alter Rebbe, the Baal the Tanya was the message, they learned together. Avram Malach taught the Baal Kabbalah, and the Baal learned with the Malach. So the story says Talmud. Okay. The Malach had a couple of sons, but the main son we need to talk about now is Shulman, because Shulman, he died young, but he had a son named Yeshua. This Yeshua became the Rebbe from Rizhin. Rizhin is a city in Ukraine, and the Rizhiner is one of the most significant and important Rebbes in his time. The whole Chassidic world revered him and looked to him as the Rebbe from that generation. Even though they had their own Chassidim, it's a concept very difficult to understand, that there should be one Rebbe to the Rebbe generation, and people have their own Rebbes, but that's always the way it was. It was a Rebbe from that generation. Yisrael Rizhiner was considered Rebbe generation. Many of the tzaddikim in that time, the Rebbes at that time, would go to Rizhin, or later in Sadegor when he fled there, which I'll talk about in 1 second, to actually be in and see him and look at his service of Hashem. So the Rizhiner lived in the city of Rizhin, which was in under Russia in Ukraine, and he was persecuted by the Russians. He was actually thrown into prison. When he was released or something like that, and was forbidden to leave Russia. However, they smuggled him out. He went into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ended up being in the city of Sadegor, which is now in Romania. He was smuggled out. They got for him false papers that said that his name was Yisroel Friedman. So the family, from then on, took the family name of Friedman, and he lived in the city of Sadegor. His children also joined him there. There are many stories about weddings and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into all these things, but essentially, he went there. He was never allowed to go back to Russia. The Russians, as I mentioned once before, another thing, were very anti-Semitic, and they very much persecuted Jews. So Yisroel Rizhin went to Sadegor. When he died, his oldest son became Rebbe in Sadegor, and his other sons became Rebbes in other places, Chodkov, among others. I can't remember all of them offhand, and was very influential both in Ukraine and the air, and they spread out to many different cities. And until today, we're going to talk about, in the next time when we talk about Rebbes today, we'll talk about some of the important ones from the Rizhin dynasty. Now, his oldest son died about a year or so after he became Rebbe, and so his second son became Rebbe in Sadegor. And so he had a number of sons. So he had a number of sons, and that started the Rizhiner dynasties, the Rizhin Chassidus, of which there's many different forms of it from the different sons, but basically the same thing. So that's Rizhin. So that's very important to understand. This goes all the way back to the Maggid of Mezrich, basically from the very beginning. Now, the Yisroel Rizhin was very close with the Baruch HaMezbez and other people at that time. There were a number of people in Russia and, Ukraine and Russia, Rebbes that we find that all were very close to each other. They interacted a lot. They were very close. There wasn't the kind of, separation as it would be starting in the fourth and generations afterward. It was still a time when the Rebbes would go to other Rebbes to see how they served Hashem. That lasted until probably the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, pretty much then. Until about the end of the 19th century, it was not unusual for a Rebbe to go to somebody else. For example, the Sanzru, who died in the 1880s, he went to Rizhin, to see the Rizhin. He went to a number of other tzaddikim, even though he was a Rebbe himself. And there were other Rebbes who went to the Sanzru. until that time. But that was still until about the middle of the 19th century, maybe a little bit afterwards, where it was not uncommon for a Rebbe to go to other Rebbes, or for people to go to different Rebbes, and multiple Rebbes to get from them the teachings of Chassidus. Okay. Again, some groups from the very beginning, that's not what happened, but it not being unusual, that went into about the middle of the 19th century, basically. Okay. Now, the next one is, in essence, maybe more important than what I mentioned earlier. I mentioned Dega Machne Ephraim, his Torahs from the Baal Shem Tov. The works of this Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Polner, are in essence more important than the Dega Machne Ephraim, in the sense that his main work is Toldos Yaakov Yosef, which is the weekly parshas. In it, it's the work that has the most. The Toldos Yaakov Yosef was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. He was there, and in his work, he quotes from the Baal Shem Tov directly many, many, many times. In fact, I have a book, a sefer here in 5 volumes, which is based on every single time that I heard from my master, the Baal Shem Tov, and explains what it means in Kabbalistic terms. On every weekly parsha, each weekly parsha, he has to have about 5 or 6 times where he mentioned he heard from the Baal Shem Tov, and then within the Torahs that he gives when he's teaching, his works are much like sermons. They can be very, very long and very complicated, and you can actually sometimes get lost in the middle of it. But what he does is he takes a teacher, sometimes to take a teaching about Shem Tov, and explain what the Baal Shem Tov is talking about. So fundamentally, this is one of the universal works, you can call it, of the Baal Shem Tov, where people go to find directly what the Baal Shem Tov taught. Okay, so this is a fundamental work. I have here, in fact, I have a 5-volume set of this because it has a commentary on it. It's important enough that somebody wrote a commentary to try and give an idea of what's being said, cross-reference and stuff like that. Okay, he wrote the Toldos. We refer to him as the Toldos from his work Toldos Yaakov Yosef, even though it says Yaakov Yosef Polner. He's usually referred to him as the Toldos. He wrote 3 other works: Ben Paras Yosef on the book of Bereshis, Genesis, Tzivana Paneach, which is on the book of Shemos, Exodus, and Kassan's Pasuk, which is on the books of Leviticus and Numbers, Vayikra Midbar. Okay, the last 3 aren't learned as much. I happen to have copies of those. They're much longer. They're much more like sermons. They're much longer things. I guess some people don't like to learn long things because you can't learn very much of them. Some Chassidic works are different stylistically. Okay, but in content, all of his works are basically expositions on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And this is basically the fundamental text of that. If you want to know what the Baal Shem Tov taught, that's where you go. In fact, before the war, there was a Ger Chosid which went to collecting all the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov into one work. He divided them by the weekly parsha, but he also divided them by the topic. So, for example, in the second parsha of Noach, he has a huge section on prayer. Okay, it's a huge section on prayer based on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov about the ark. He has a huge section on prayer, and in fact, there's an edition which came out recently with a commentary on the commentary that this Ger Chosid had, which actually separated that whole thing. It's like hundreds of pages long just on prayer, teaching to the Baal Shem Tov on prayer. Very, very deep things, Kabbalistic and things and stuff like that. But this is so. But fundamentally, the majority of things are taken from Toldos Yaakov Yosef because these come directly from the Baal Shem Tov, from somebody who was actually a Talmud who heard directly from the Baal Shem Tov. So again, I think if you want to consider as important, this is the number 1 important work of teaching the Baal Shem Tov. There's other works, Tzivus Adavash, which is collections of teaching of the Baal Shem Tov himself, which I didn't mention earlier. There are other things that exist with that, but really, in the Chassidic world, this is really one of the most fundamental ones. Now, the Baal Shem Tov had a number of other Talmidim of import. The first one I want to talk about, not because of it, specifically because of his importance, as far as Talmidim, he really had a limited effect in the future. This was Rabbi Nachman Hardadenka. Rabbi Nachman Hardadenka is important because of 2 things. One, we mentioned earlier, his son was the father of Nachman Breslev. So he's the grandfather of Nachman Breslev, who was named after him. We talk about Breslev and its importance. Number two is with him and a number of people, we mentioned them, there was the first Aliyah of Chassidim to Israel, Eretz Yisrael. They came and settled in Tiberia, and they're buried there. There's an old cemetery in Tiberia that dates from this time, where you can go and see where he's buried there. I have pictures when I went there once of their burial places in Tiberia. This was the first group from Eastern Europe that came as a group of Hasidim. Now later, the Litvisha, the Talmidim from the Vilna Gaon, would also come, but they went pretty much in the same time as the second Aliyah of Hasidic Rebbes going to Israel. The individual came, but there were specifically Hasidic Rebbes who went. And Nachum Herdenka and the second person would be one of those. So that's what makes him somewhat important, besides being a, marriage ties with the Baal Shem Tov. The second one we're going to talk about is the Mechel Zlotchever. Mechel Zlotchever actually was the founder of a dynasty. His sons became Rebbes in various cities, like Zvil, like Zbrij, and a number of cities, again, cities in the Ukraine. And they do come into the present day, so we will talk about them, we talk about that. He was very influential. He had a number of very important Talmidim who followed him. They went to the Rebbe Bear of Mezrich, but they also went to him. Again, as I said before, in the beginning, people would go to different Talmidim from the Baal Shem Tov, not just specifically to one. The Rebbe Bear from Mezrich was the most important one because of his work at spreading Chassidus, but the Mechel Zlotchever was important because he founded a dynasty. Okay, among the important Talmidim from Mechel Zlotchever, he had Talmidim that became rabbis there, but they're more locally involved. They have swarm that are interesting, which I have, but they're not, more universal. One of his Talmidim whose works were and are now universally learned was Rabbi Chaim of Charnovitz. Okay, he was a Talmid Mechel Zlotchever only. Didn't go to Mezrich. He wrote two works were important. On the weekly parshas, he wrote a work called Bar Mam Chaim. His teachings are quite long. It's more like sermons length rather than just short Torahs, which we find some rabbis have. The Baal Shem Tov's teachings were mostly very short. We have very short statements from the Baal Shem Tov, where in Toldus Yankel Yosef he will expound on it. David Machnav will expound as to what his grandfather meant. Toldus will expound what the Baal Shem Tov meant. Okay, and the second work, which is a very interesting work, is called Seder Shel Shabbos. That means the order of Shabbos, in which he discusses the Kabbalistic and Hasidic things about Shabbos, talking from the very beginning, before Shabbos, preparations for Shabbos, and going through every single time within Shabbos, explaining what's going on Kabbalistically at this time, what's going on, and above. It's a very interesting thing. It's a very common thing learned among the real Hasidim learn that. We say that if you haven't learned it twice, you can't really feel the holiness of Shabbos. You really don't feel it. Okay. I had a Rebbe who was one of my mentors and taught me, and he basically taught this all the time. And Shabbos by him was totally amazing. I've never been by any other Rebbe where you really felt the holiness of Shabbos like I felt like him. I spent many years, going to him, and you never felt the holiness of Shabbos I could feel when I was by his house. Okay, another Talmud from the Baal Shem Tov is Noachim of Chernobyl. The Noachim Chernobyl is accounted as a Talmud from the Baal Shem Tov, but also Talmud from the Rebbe Bear from Mezrich, because he went to both. Now, Chernobyl was very important because his son, Mordechai of Chernobyl, founded the Chernobyl dynasty. All of his sons became Rebbes in different places. So we have, Chernobyl, Skver, Rachmastrivka, Tolna, Trisk. There's a bunch of them. He had a bunch of sons, and they all became Rebbes. They spread out basically throughout the Ukraine. That's where they were mainly in the Ukraine, and in some parts of Russia, basically in the Ukraine. Now, very important, Noachim Chernobyl has another work. He has a work that he wrote called Ma'or Einayim. In it, he also quotes directly from the Baal Shem Tov things he heard. Okay, so we have actually three works where we have direct quotations of people who directly heard Torah from Baal Shem Tov. That's what makes his work very, very important. it's the easier one. In my mind, it's the easier one to learn of the three. Daigle is very difficult. Told Yank Yosef is hard because of his style of writing is very difficult. Somewhat easy to learn, but it's just very, it's like a sermon. It's not like a thing. Maranayim is not like that. It's like a teaching, and it's much easier to understand. Again, we're talking about things on a very, very difficult level. Even for people of Hasidim, for the whole life of the learning, these works are on a very difficult level, very difficult to understand. But again, this is a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. But if you look into what he writes, this is pure from the Baal Shem Tov with Baal Shem Tov stuff and explanations of it. Again, his son started the Chernobyl dynasties, which were very, very influential in the Ukraine, very big in Ukraine. They spread out and then they went to different places. Nowadays, it's in America and Israel from them. But we'll talk about that later. When we get to the present day, which is going to be in our next session. The next one is Pinchas of Koretz. Pinchas of Koretz never wrote a book, and he didn't really found a Chassidus. Now, there is a collection of his teachings called Imre Pinchas. They came out Imre Pinchas, a new version of it a number of years ago, which is expanded version taken from a lot of different forms from it. So it's now 2 volume set. But essentially, it's not one of these things we'd call universal. Okay, people get it because they want to have an insight into what the Baal Shem Tov taught, but it's not a universal work like Toldos Yaakov Yosef, David Ephraim, or the Naim. It's not a universal work. It's a more like a specialty kind of thing. What makes him important is because when Baal Shem Tov died, before he died, his Talmidim came to him and asked him, what should they do? So the Baal Shem Tov told him, obviously in Yiddish, the Baal Shem Tov didn't speak English. He told him in Yiddish that there's a bear in the forest, meaning the dove bear from Message, and Pinchas is a chacham. Pinchas is a wise person, indicating that these were the 2 people that they should go to, specifically the Pinchas and the dove bear. Okay, so he's a significant person. We do have teaching from him nowadays, but again, it's not so, it's not so important. I look into it all the time, especially Simchas Torah. There's a number of things that he taught about Simchas Torah, which really enhances my experience. He talks Kabbalistic things what are going on by when we dance and stuff like that. So it's a very, very it's very moving and important. I actually showed it to my son-in-law once. I had a copy when I gave it to him. So he asked me to make a copy and give it to him so that he could look at it before Simchas Torah also, in order to be inspired when it comes to that time. Okay, the next one we want to deal with is from the city of Pri Mishkan. There were two actually important Talmidim from the city of Pri Mishkan. First one's Meir Hagudo, the great mayor. The reason why he's called great is because he had a grandson called Meir of Pri Mishkan, the second one, who was a very famous miracle worker. He was also very helpful when the Rizhiner fled from Russia. He helped him to get out of the Ukraine and into the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to actually settle in what we call now Romania. So he was very known. There are collections of his teaching around, but he's very well known because he was known for miracles. People would go to him and have miracles all the time. And there were rebbes that was a big thing by them to do miracles. Most of the rebbes, it was like, a minor thing, to the point that some rebbes, they were embarrassed that somebody found out that they did a miracle. It's famous stories about the Opshazidov, who we'll talk about later, who, when they found out that he did a miracle, he was ashamed and didn't even want to go out in front of people. They didn't want them to see them. Okay. But Meir Prishama was known for there have been rabbis over the years like that. I remember when many years ago, it was in New York, a rabbi called the Rimnitzer, and whenever you needed something really serious, you go to him, and he gave out miracles right and left. I've heard phenomenal stories about things that he did. Just totally unbelievable. Okay. Now, a nephew of Meir Pri Mishkan, this Meir that I talked about just now, the second one, was Mordechai ben Vanna. Mordechai ben Vanna did found a dynasty, the Vanna Rebbes until today, and also Kretchen. We're going to talk about them. They're somewhat different than other groups. There's a cipher, a book that came out of his teaching, also very small, within his own Chassidus is learned. Remember, when a dynasty has one of the Rebbes writes a cipher, within that dynasty, that cipher is always learned. It becomes one of the books that are fundamental to that dynasty, but not necessarily something that other people learn. It has to be of a certain caliber that other people are going to want to learn. Okay, we'll see that there are a few of them that became universal. even though they were written by Rebbes from a certain dynasty. Okay. Again, the teachings called Maimon Mordechai. It's very interesting. The Torah is very, very nice, very short, and very nice. But it's not like a world thing. It's something that's specifically for those people in that dynasty they learned it. Okay. The other person who lived in Pnei Mishkan was Menachem Mendel, Pnei Mishkan. He's mostly remembered not just for he was a Rebbe for other people, but he was one of the Rebbes who went with Nachman Hardenka to Eretz Yisrael, and he's buried in that cemetery in Tveria. I have pictures of it. He's buried there. So that's Nachman. He went with Nachman Hardenka. He was part of the first Aliyah of Chassidim to Israel. That's the first foundation, the Chassidic in Israel. It would eventually be in both in Tveria and also in the city of Tzfas. Yerushalayim also had, but much later, because Yerushalayim was a Sephardic community there, and they didn't allow Ashkenazim in there until much later. But he went to Eretz Yisrael. The next one I want to have is not so much important as for his being a Talmud from the Baal Shem Tov, but because of his son. This was Rabbi Yaakov Koppel. He was known to have been the leader of the prayers for the Baal Shem Tov. He led the prayers there. But his son, Menachem Mendel, became Rebbe in the city of Kosov. He wrote a work of Hava Shulam. Again, those who come from the Kosov dynasty, which includes visions today, learn it. It's a very nice cipher. Again, it's not a universal cipher, it's one with them, but a lot of people like to look at it. I look at it also, even though I've had some relationships with visions, so I like reading some visions for them, at least some of them. Hava Shulam is a very nice cipher, but again, it's more particulars. It's not a universal work. It's not something that everybody learns. Okay. Now, we'll just end off this first section so I can take a little bit of a break. And I will mention 4 other Talmidim from the Baal Shem Tov who, if you look into Chassidic history at all, from the Baal Shem Tov, if you look at anything about that time, these names will come up. The first one is Shpola Zaida, Aryeh Leib. I can't remember his last name. It's just not on my tongue at the moment. He was one of the more well-known Talmidim for the Baal Shem Tov. The second one is Meir Magulius. He was a rabbi of Astro, and his brother him and his brother, when they were young, I think they were like Bar Mitzvah, came to the Baal Shem Tov and came from his Talmidim. He wrote a work called Sod Yuchad Avois, and within it, he describes the Baal Shem Tov, who he met, who he was a Talmidim, met the kind of person and he talks about the holiness of Baal Shem Tov, how holy he was. Personal experience with him. Okay. The next one was Leib Seres, who was a very big tzaddik, very well known for that. And he was called Leib Seres. I mean, he was named the Seres because of his mother. He was an orphan, and his mother was a very righteous woman, and because of her righteousness, he grew up and to be a very big tzaddik. The last one is Wolf Kitzis. Wolf Kitzis appears in many of the stories about the Baal Shem Tov. So there's a cipher that's outside Shivchei Baal Shem Tov, the praise of Baal Shem Tov, which brings a lot of stories heard directly from people who heard direct from people who knew the Baal Shem Tov. And Wolf Kitzis is one of those people mentioned among other people from Talmidim from the Baal Shem Tov. It's actually in English. I don't like it because it's put together by a scholar and he attacks the veracity of the stories, but we believe that every story there is true, or at least could have been true. And since they have people who said who heard from this person who was actually there, I think there's a lot of reliability of at least those parts of the stories that have a chain of transmission. Okay, that's the Baal Shem Tov. We're going to talk about the Rabbi of Mezrich and his how he spread Chassidus next. But let me just take a break, and if we have any questions, I will entertain those questions then. Let's see. I didn't look at anything on the YouTube to see if anybody there says anything. This is a little bit of an unusual topic. I don't know if any other teacher, anybody who teaches Noahide who actually goes into such things. Again, I think it's important because as Noahide, you're interacting with the Jewish world, and it is important to know about the Jewish world and what you're going to encounter when you speak to people. The Chassidic world is a very closed off world. Okay, it's very closed, except for Chabad and certain people in Breslov. It's pretty much a closed world. We live in our ghettos. You know, I live in a community that, there's a few non-Jews around here. When it comes to the holidays this time of year, you could find a few people with decorations for the holidays, but not very much. Very, very rare. It's hard
But
to find.
it's even closed to Jews.
What?
I said it's even closed to Jews
Well, it's not,
because
but
yeah, I
it's a
mean, I'm
very
just saying I've been to many Hasidic shuls and being the only guy wearing a black hat, regular black hat.
well, no. If you're wearing a black hat, you'll be more. You know, if you're Jewish, listen, you can go
But
to any.
not as trimal is what I'm saying.
You can go to if you're Jewish, you go to any shul, you will be welcome there to come up to you and say hello and something like that. But you will still feel an outsider. I mean, if you go, the truth matters, if you go to Hasidic shul, like first of all, we're all speaking Yiddish anyway, so automatically you can feel like an outsider because it's
Right.
it's a language you don't even understand. Okay, so automatically you can feel an outsider there. I mean, not that everybody doesn't speak English. I mean, everybody speaks English there. Just like if you
Right.
go to Israel, almost everybody in Israel speaks English also. But if you don't speak Hebrew or don't understand it, you're gonna have a problem. Okay. Same thing. If you go to Chassidic, shul, they all speak Yiddish. They all speak Yiddish. It's just normal language. Okay. Even the non-Jews they used to say that the non-Jews who worked on 47th Street, where the diamond district the people, the non-Jews who worked there all spoke Yiddish because you'd hear Yiddish all day long, and so you
You
could
learn it.
learn it. Yeah. So it is functionally a very close community. Okay. So it's important to know what it is because most of I have a video. It's very nice. If you want to know a little bit about the Jews, get a little bit of insight about the Hasidic community. It's called The Life Apart. Now, some of the commentaries, some of those things are not. It's not written from it's not from that, but it goes to. In fact, it is so authentic that if I was sitting with you, I would stop and say, "That guy I know." There's a guy there, Yechiel Weingarten. In the very beginning, you see him walking the street, Weingarten. He was a guy who I know for a fact he was on Schindler's List. He lived in Krakow. He was one of the people on Schindler's List, and that's who was saved through the war. And he has children and grandchildren. And now he's not alive. He died many years ago. But great grandchildren who go totally Hasidic dressed. But so he appears in the beginning. They're taking pictures. Hasidic people walking in Manhattan. He's there in the middle, and this guy was on Schindler's List. So Schindler's List is not a movie. It was a real thing. There were people who are alive today. Their children, their grandchildren alive in the community where I live. That I know that their grandfather, great grandfather, was on Schindler's List. So it's a very it is something. It's really worth your while if you want to have an idea. It has about Lubavitch. You'll feel that clearer from Lubavitch. Lubavitch is much more open. They have somebody from Belz who's more from the modern sides of Belz than from the more Hasidic side from Belz. And they have from Bubba somebody who I knew personally, Meyer Horowitz, wonderful fellow. Oh, he was so sweet, very sweet Jew. And his family, I know Nebel, the person who was there, the young man, just died recently. Very young, was in 60s, very tragic story, died young. But if you want to get an idea of the Hasidic world and what it's like and see Hasidim and see Rebbes and stuff like that, it has a very wonderful, a lot of pictures from a wedding in there from the late Baba Ruv, his first grandchild getting married, which is just beautiful. It's just really beautiful. So if you want to see a video of some sort about Hasidic life and something, I really would recommend that. Even though there are negatives about it, the people who talk about this, the whole thing about a reform rabbi in a hospital, that the Hasidic parents didn't want her speaking to her child because they didn't want to say the truth. They want to speak to her child because she's just not what she says is in Judaism. Didn't want to say that there, but that's basically what it was. So there's a few things in there that I find somewhat objectionable, but there's a guy in Williamsburg, a fish store owner. This guy, it's worth it just to see this guy talking because he's really, really a good example of what Hasidim are like. He even talks about, he says, listen, I'm not going to watch this movie anyways, But if you can make some money out of it, it's fine. It really is beautiful. Okay, it's really, you can see what it is. And Hasidim are basically, in general, you'll see that Hasidim are basically cut off in the world. Aaron, I know you had your hand up. I'm sorry. I was just, talking about this issue.
Well, you're speaking of things that I'm actually experiencing now. It's going into the Chabad community and being around Hasidim like I've been. I think that a lot of the stuff that you talked about, the history, I started learning that back about 17 years ago, and I actually have heard the name the Maggid of Mezerich and different other rabbis who are part of this history. And recently, when I went to 770 with my rabbi, and we went through the place, he took me to the upstairs portion where they have the history and the dynasties that you talked about, and they're all laid out in cases up there. So when you walk through, you see everybody. You see how they go all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov. And then, just being in that world, when I walk in the door, I was treated like a stranger, but I was with the representative who is one of those rabbis, little groups that you talk about. So that even in that place, this is a microcosm of the Jewish world. So it's the same thing all over.
What I have to say is like this. We're going to find out, we're going to discuss about Chabad soon, because he is among the Talmidim from the Bear of Mezrich. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about Chabad itself. Chabad,
but the traditions are the same, right?
Yeah. Well, Chabad in itself is very similar to Breslov in that it's very focused on what the Baal Tanya said, and does not have all these other things that other groups would have. So when we talk about the works that are universal, like Told Shakav Yosef, if you ask somebody Chabad about, they may have heard of it, but they've never seen it, they've never learned it, or a number of other things. They don't. They only learn what their rabbis learn, and for them that's similar like in Breslov as far as that kind of approach. But different. So we'll talk about that also. As far as that, to tell you, Chabad is the most friendly Hasidic place you're ever going to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Just so you should know, it's the most friendly. In fact,
well, when he walked in the room, the thing is, he said Parsha Noah to everybody who was looking very curiously, and all of a sudden the guards went down immediately when he said those words.
Yeah, but again, the point is that Chabad is in fact the most welcoming for Noahide, because the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very much pushing it. Other Rebbes don't at all, not at all. Okay. So again, that's why I always suggest for Noahides, if you want to go someplace, go to Chabad, even though I have lots of difference with them as far as comes Chassidus and stuff like that. But still, as far as a Noahide, doesn't make it, the difference between Chabad and other places should not make a difference to you as far as being a Noahide. And if any teacher is teaching you in such a way that makes those differences important to you, then you should be very careful about that, because you don't want to be a Chabad Noahide. You want to be a Noahide, meaning that okay, I understand people, you understand that people like me are going to be much less open. I mean, me, I'm open. If you came to New York, I'd certainly want to meet you, obviously. Okay, but people would not be as openly as friendly, because we're just very closed up. A lot of this has to do with history. A lot of it has to do very simply is that in order to keep up the type of life that we have to have a separation from the world. Again, if you see that a life apart, you should really look at that. You would actually enjoy it, because the chief rabbi of Chabad in Russia is actually on that before he went to Russia. So you see somebody who's really Chabad with that. It would give you a much more better idea of the Hasidic world, much more somebody. Now, I don't make any money on it, so if you buy it, whatever, I'm not going to get a kickback on it. But I do think if you can get a hold of it, maybe you can, online. I don't know if you have it online. I have the DVD from it. Okay.
Is the movie A Stranger Among Us similar to that?
I don't know about it. I know Life Apart because I knew about it because many years ago somebody sent me a clip from it of the wedding, which I was at that wedding. I know everybody who was there at the wedding. Okay. I know all of them. In fact, the boy who got married then has already married off some of his children, is now a grandfather. So, but That's sort of weird, actually, is knowing great-grandchildren, Rebbe, my Rebbe, and then his great-great-grandchildren. I knew them as they were like, young adults. But that's a different story. It's called, I don't know Stranger Among Us. I don't really know what that is. So I haven't seen it. The reason why is because this was originally sent to me. Somebody showed me that there was pictures of this wedding. And I got it because of that. I wanted to see it. And I went through it. The family, there was a family from the Bubba community. I happen to know people there. Okay. And I happen to know this person and his sons. One of his sons was actually a Malamed, which is a rabbi for kids, at the same time as I was in the same place. So I knew him and his family. His father's very, very sweet, lovable. I mean, he's not here for a number of years. He lived through the war. Okay, so we don't have now those people who went through the camps during the war. There's maybe a handful even left nowadays. Not like it was 50 years ago, where 40, 50 years ago, we had a lot of people who were still around from the camps who would talk about what it was like during the war and how they suffered in the camps for like this particular person in there, Maya Horowitz, was in the camps under the Nazis for 5 years. He was in the work camps for 5 years. There were two kinds of camps. There were the death camps where they killed you automatically, but if you were young like he was, they sent you to the work camps. And basically, they worked you to death. High percentage of them died in the camps, but some people like him, he made it through. He was young, he was strong enough, so he made it through. But he was in camp for 5 years. So it's not really relevant to what's saying there. But again, the word of life apart is a very good thing to read if you want to see more of real life, what it's like. Okay. And you see a lot of things there. It's very interesting. It doesn't go through all the communities anymore, but it does give you a very good idea. And truthfully, the best part of it is there's a fishmonger, the fish store owner in Williamsburg. He speaks only Yiddish. So the people who interview spoke Yiddish, but they have underneath it, they have it translated in English. And you got to see this guy. This guy is the sweetest Jew you've ever met. It's really wonderful. And he's a good example of what Chassidim are like. The separation from the world. They're not caring about anything outside of their own world. They don't want to know what's going on, but a very, very sweet person. It's worth it just to see, him and the few interactions they have with him, which are very nice. Anyways, that's the point. There were a couple of questions I had here, and then I really want to go on. Okay. Wells is telling me there is a review of it. Oh, I don't know. I don't know what I don't mean 100%. Whatever. I wouldn't really care what they say because, first of all, the only people you should really care about who are reviewing it are people who are Chassidim. Okay. So I would give it on a scale of 1 to 10. I would say it's about an 8 or an 8, between 8 and 9 of accuracy. And as far as important, as far as things are concerned, is if you really want to know, the few negative things that I could say about it are hugely overwhelmed by the positive things that you can actually learn from the actual, learning of it. These are things that you do not see. You don't know the world. You'll see what it is. You see how the world looks. Chassidim are very, they're like the Jewish Amish. They're their own, communities. They're separated from the whole world. I mean, not we don't use electricity, but it's basically the Jewish Amish. They even look like the Amish sometimes. If it wasn't for the pious, we'd probably look like the Amish. So what can I tell you? But it really is something that I very strongly recommend to any Noahide who's sort of interested in this part of what Judaism, what it is, and why, what kind of reactions that they get, and why they're getting the kind of reactions they get. You should see what it's like. You see how the communities are just not interested, in Super Bowls and baseball games and hockey and all these. These have absolutely no meaning within the world. Okay, so that's what it is. Helen asked a question: what makes a Rebbe a Rebbe? Oh boy, that is the $1 million question. Okay, my kids had a tape when they were younger. It was talking about people coming into America and Ellis Island, and this Jewish guy comes in and he has a chauffeur, You all know what a shofar is. It's the horn that they blow. Okay, now being Yiddish speaking, so they asked him, what's a shofar? And he said, a shofar? A shofar is a shofar. What's a shofar? That's what a shofar is. An Rebbe is an Rebbe. It's my Rebbe person I've known for 40 years. 40 years ago, he was a Rebbe. He wasn't a Rebbe. He didn't have Chassidim yet, but he was a Rebbe. You could see from the way he lived, his life, his holiness, his learning Torah, his service of Hashem. You could see he was a Rebbe. There are people that are just Rebbes. Okay? There's another one I know in Muncie. There's the Satmar Rul from Muncie. He's also related. He actually went with my Rebbe in Koilel together when I was in Koilel together. And he was born to be a Rebbe. It's something you can't want to be. You're either born to it, or Hashem makes you with it, but and that's what it is. I mean, a lot of people think being a Rebbe is a really nice thing. You have Chassidim, you get support and all of that, but it's really not. I always tell the story about Rebbes. My Alter Rebbe, first one I had for like 20-something, 30 years. He died in the year 2000. I was once waiting to go into him. So there was a woman who came in, and usually they take a woman, they leave the door open because he shouldn't be alone with a woman in the room. But she wanted to relate her story. And the woman started crying. She was crying straight. It had to be almost a half an hour. I do not know how my Rebbe could have lasted that long, listening to her crying. I don't know what she said. It was hard to hear. All you could hear was her crying, constantly crying for almost a half an hour. I mean, you got to be nuts if you want to take that job, because people come to you with their problems and everything like that. You got to be nuts. I mean, you'll be crazy. I remember once so much again, Alter Rebbe that I had, I went to him. I had just had a child, and I went to him, to tell him that I had a child and what was going on. And he was so happy. He tells me, oh, Moshe, you don't understand. People come with so many tzuras that I can hear something good that happened. Somebody as a child, a simple, I feel so good hearing that because of all the things that I hear. I mean, somebody who wants to dedicate their life to hearing everybody's problems and everybody's things, everything back, you got to be a little bit crazy to want to be that. But some people are born that's just what, I mean, I was very close to my Rebbe. When he became a Rebbe, I felt sorry for him because, the burdens that came onto him being a Rebbe, in addition to, he's his tefillas, he prays. I mean, he's a phenomenal person. But a Rebbe is something it's like a diamond, okay? If you know how to look at a diamond, what it is, you know what it is. And if you don't know what it is, I mean, it's a nice stone. It looks nice, but you don't really know what it is. It's very hard to explain what a Rebbe is, okay? A Rebbe is like a diamond. If you know how to look and know what to look for, you could say, oh, this is worth a lot of money. And if you don't, I mean, it looks like it's one, but it's not really. I hope that answers your question. It's a very difficult thing to explain. I mean, there are Chassidic forum, we'll talk about it. More of a Shemesh, which we're going to talk about sometime soon. He says at Rebbe, somebody to be a Rebbe, you have to, from your early childhood, to live a life of holiness, learning Torah, serving Hashem. And if you do that, then maybe you might one day become a Rebbe. Okay, it's not something you can want to be. It's something, that just is that, your soul is that way. Okay, let's continue now. We want to keep this under, 6 hours, I guess. Some of these questions go on. This session at 7 o'clock always is long because there's always more questions. We always get on subjects. Okay, so this is the second part. We're going to talk about the Bear from Mezrich and his Talmidim. The Bear from Mezrich is very important because of one thing. I mean, many things, of course. His teaching is the continuation of the Baal Shem Tov itself, with his own take on a number of things. But what's most important is from him spread out the Chassidic movement from the small area of Ukraine all over Eastern Europe, so that eventually the Chassidic movement basically took over all of Eastern Europe except for Lithuania. There were Chassidim in Lithuania, Chassidic groups that were in Lithuania, but essentially outside of Lithuania, it basically took over everything. Okay. Now, the first one of importance, not because the most of the Chassidim came out of it, the first one important was Aaron of Kolin. Aaron of Kolin was in Russia. His Talmidim also went up into the Ukraine. Actually, not in Ukraine. He went in Russia, and also some went into Lithuania, his area that he felt covered there. So there are many Talmidim of his who were there. Important. He was a Thomas of message, and there is a Carline dynasty that came from him. We're going to talk about that again in a second, because we're going to talk about his son and grandson. He died before the Maggid Mezrich, and after he died, his number one Talmud took over with Shlomo. A Levi was in Carline. His son, Usher, was too young to be Rebbe. So Shlomo Carline was a Rebbe, and Usher eventually did become Rebbe when Shlomo Carline died. Rabbi Shlomo Carline, very interesting, he was shot by a Cossack who heard him daven. The way of davening the Carlinas was it was very loud. They would daven very loud. So a Cossack went by and heard him davening and shot him with his gun. Nothing happened to the Cossack, by the way, because killing a Jew was never really such a big thing in Russia. If you killed a Jew, they wouldn't bother you about that. That's how serious anti-Semitism was in Russia. But he died, he was killed because he was a Jew in the middle of his prayers. Now, the Shulman had a number of Talmidim that were important. Iris Filisker was a Talmud, and there were a number of other Talmidim that he had. But the two main ones that were important was Aaron Carline's son of Usher. Usher was a Rebbe only for a few years, a very short amount of time, and his son of Aaron, the second Aaron of Carline, was a Rebbe for quite a while. And this Aaron Carline is basically the main founder of the Carline dynasty. And he wrote a work called Beis Aharon, and his son of Usher was a Rebbe afterwards. And so Carline continues on from them. The cipher Beis Aharon is a very interesting cipher. Again, it's primarily learned in Carline, but people who are Hasidim in other places, in other groups, sometimes like to learn it because of it. They like what he says. It's very nice. The other Rebbe, who was Mordechai Lechowitz, he was a Talmud, and he's very important because of what comes out of his disciple. Now, he had a son who became a Rebbe, who was very small. The majority of his Hasidim went to the Moshe of Kabbalah. The Moshe of Kabbalah also had sons, but the main person who came at him was Avram of Solanim. Avram of Solanim, I believe, is also in Lechowitz. And the Kabbalah, I think, also went to Shlomo Carline. I'm not really sure. But these three, when it comes to Solanim is a very big Chassidus today. It's a right-side Chassidus. Personally, I have a very big shaykhus. My Rebbe Zechron Levrucha, he learned in the Solanim Yeshiva in Yerushalayim after the war, and he was very close to the Solanim Derech. He learned a lot of things from there. And I have basically all of the Solanim Sforim that came out, and they are really beautiful. They're very, very nice. The Chassidus, the things that they talk about in Avodas Hashem and stuff like that are very, very beautiful. I love it very much, and I learn it quite often, even though it's not from my group, but it's good. Again, these forms that from Solanim are basically for Solanim, but then you will find people like me who learn even other outside. The next one is extremely important. This is Reb Shmelk of Nikolsburg. He's important primarily because his main Talmud, Rabbi Elamai from Lizenz, who was also a Talmud in Mezrich, but after he died, he went to one of these, after the Mezrich Shemaga died, he went to the Shmelk of Nikolsburg. That's who he was assigned under. Now, he was also a Rebbe in the time of Shmelka at the same time, which was also not uncommon then. And we're going to deal with Rabbi Malach of Lizenz in separate as part of the third generation because of his own importance. Now, also, we have to consider here Rabbi Zisha, Rabbi Malach's brother. If you read books on Chassidic rabbis and stories, you will invariably come into one of the most talked about rabbis was Rabbi Zisha of Hanapola. Okay, he was a Talmud Rabbi Bear, and he fits pretty much in here with his brother. Okay. Now, the Rabbi Malach wrote a work which is a universal work, meaning that the Hasidim in all groups will learn. It's called Noahide Malach. You will see that in all groups. Again, when I say all groups, I'm leaving out Chabad. Sorry, but that's just the way I have to talk about it, because otherwise, I don't want to say everybody except Chabad and maybe possibly Bresla. But so I said everybody. It means in Chabad, you most likely not, and Bresla possibly maybe might look at it, but it's not so influential. Noahide Malach is very influential. It talks a lot about the idea of tzaddikim, different levels of tzaddikim. holy people, and it's a fundamental text and is very influential in all the next generations. Now, among the other Talmidim, Rabbi Shmelke, of those that are of importance, is Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Kalev, the Kalev Rebbe. He was the first Rebbe in Hungary. So he started the spreading of this Chassidic movement into Hungary. Another one of the Talmidim was Moshe Leib Sasava. He's somewhat of a minor figure, but very well known from the Talmidim. There's a lot of stories about him. There is a Sasava dynasty until today, and there is a Sasava Rebbe. Excuse me, very small Hasidic group. And there's certain groups that married into, so Munkach somehow they're related to Sasa. The last relation to Reb Shmelke that I think is important to mention is there was a Rebbe in Boston, Pinchas David from Boston. He was a direct descendant of Shmelke of Nikolsburg. So all the Boston Rebbes that you know of, there's in Israel, there's in New York, and often still in Boston, they are descendants of him, and essentially they go back to Shmelke of Nikolsburg. I think I remember mentioned Reb Shmelke's brother Pinchas of Frankfurt. I may not have mentioned it. Maybe I did mention it or didn't. I don't know. He had a brother with Pinchas, who both of them were rabbis and Talmidim in Mezrich. Reb Shmelke was the rabbi in the city of Nikolsburg, which was the main city in what's called Moravia. Moravia is part of the Czech Republic now. Okay, there's Bohemia and Moravia. Moravia was where Nikolsburg was the main city. Bohemia, I think Prague was the main city in Bohemia. I don't really remember. I think it was Prague. Was the main city in Bohemia, and the main city of Moravia was Nikolsburg. So as the rabbi of Nikolsburg, he was the head rabbi in the city, in the area known as Moravia. It was a kingdom of its own. Okay, now Pinchas was in Frankfurt. His children's house didn't remain Hasidim because Frankfurt was one of the centers of the Haskalah and the Reform movement. So Frankfurt basically went downhill from then. So he wrote a book that's very common that people read. His commentaries on the Talmud are learned, very important works on that. And he also had influence on the head of Hungarian Jewry, Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer. I mean, Chassam Sofer was a Talmud of his also. Okay, so he had a certain influence in Hungary, which is very important because it affected that in Hungary, they were not very against Hasidim. The last one that I would talk about is Reb Mendel of Vitebsk. Of the main ones that he sent to Mendel of Vitebsk, this area was basically White Russia. I don't think in the Ukraine, but basically in White Russia where he was, areas like that. He was an orphan young, and he lived in the house of the Baal Shem Tov, so he was also Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, but he's considered from the Rebbe Ber from Mezrich as Talmidim, and the Rebbe sent him to be in that he should set up from Vitebsk province. Vitebsk may, I think, be in Ukraine. I don't know, but it's the Ukraine, White Russia, that area. Now, what's important about him is two things. Number one, there was a second Aliyah to Israel. He led it. His number one Talmud, Avram Kolesk, who took over after him, joined him in Israel. And Mendel and Avram and Avram Kolesk are all buried in Tveria. But they set up the community there. And the community there eventually became associated with Karlin somehow. I don't know historically how that happened, but it was. When he went to Israel, in the area where he came from, in White Russia, he left 3 of his Talmidim to be watching over the people there. One of them was Shneur Zalman Vliad. Okay? Now, when the Mendel of Vitebsk died, the Hasidim there, in general, followed Avram Kolesk. So you'll find the Solanim Hasidim and Altim and many of the others, they will align themselves and revere the Mendel of Vitebsk and Avram Kolesk. Whereas the Shneur Zalman, the author of the Tanya, his Hasidim, you won't really hear them talking about Vitebsk at all as being the Alter Rebbe's Rebbe. But that's really the fact of what it was. He was under him and eventually became a Rebbe. I believe that the Shneur Zalman's grandson, Menachem Mendel, is named after the Vitebsk. It was very common to name after, for example, the Shneur Zalman's son, Dov Ber, was named after the Maggid of Mezrich. So it's not unusual for names like that to be, being named after them. Now, Shir Zalman is, of course, important because he's the founder of the dynasty of Lubavitch. His work, the Tanya, is basically, you can compare it to the Likutei Moharan for the Menachem Breslov. All of Chabad Hasidus is based off of that one Mukaran. So the subjects that Tanya talks about, they are the subjects that you see in Chabad Hasidus. Subjects that don't appear in Tanya are basically unknown. So where you have universal works like Degel Machne Ephraim, talking about all kinds of things that the Baal Shem Tov talks about and explained, the Tanya is only gearing on certain things, and that's what in Chabad that they concentrate on. So in a sense, it's certain things that he has there, but it's concentrated. But now the Tanya itself, interesting, is a universal work, meaning that those people are real Chassidim in other places learn Tanya. I learned Tanya numerous times because it's something that real Chassidim, people who are interested in Chassidus and want to know what it's about, different things about serving Hashem, they learn Tanya. It's a work that people learn, and they know Tanya and they understand concepts and could quote from it. That's going by everybody. But in Chabad, it's Tanya, and everything outside of that is just not within their purview. They don't see it. Many works that we mentioned till now, Degel, Todas Yankagasa, Sadir Shoshabes, Ba'amayim Chaim, things that are universally accepted by all Hasidim, teachings that you might have from the Rishon, for example. All these things that all over the place, different Hasidim groups will take because the universality of this, in Chabad they don't have. So Chabad you get a certain thing like that. Okay, this factor. So that's it. Now, interesting enough, I don't know if people know very much about Chabad history. Chabad history, but after the Dov Ber was Nifter, they didn't know who to take as a Rebbe. They ended up taking Dov Ber's son-in-law, Menachem Mendel, who was also descended from Baal Tanya, but there were other son-in-laws who were asked about it. I know one of them who was asked and refused to take it. Now, when Menachem Mendel died, he had a number of sons. His youngest son became Rebbe in Lubavitch, and that's where the Lubavitch dynasty that we know of came from. However, there were others. There was a very big one in Kapust, and the Kapust Rebbes came out with a cipher called Magen Uvos, which I have. It's basically very similar to Likutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe, very similar type of writing from it, but it was its own flavor of Chabad. There were different flavors of Chabad. The Baal Tanya had a Talmud, Adam Stercelia, who came out with a work which is basically a commentary on the Tanya, 2-volume work, very, very deep and very difficult. And he had Chassidim. His son was whatever after him, but after that they basically disappeared. Okay, so there were other flavors of Chabad, but eventually, when we get to today's day, basically after the war and stuff like that, after what happened with Russia, basically it was only Lubavitch, which carried on the Chabad tradition. So Chabad again was separated, but it's basically all based on the Alter Rebbe and his teachings. Okay, so a lot of things that other Chassidic groups take for granted is from teachings from the Baal Shem Tov, because they were universal. In Chabad, they don't know that. That explains a lot of the different customs that Chabad has from other places. Okay, so let's do the last few Talmidim of the Maggid that are important, and I'll take another break for questions. After these people who were involved with the spreading Chassidus, there are a number of Rebbes who are important, who weren't fundamental in spreading Chassidus. The first one was Levi Yitzchak Berditchev. I mentioned him before because he was the editor, I guess you should call it more rather than the author of Or HaEmes, where he wrote down the teachings that he heard from the Maggid. And his work, Kedushas Levi, is a universal work, meaning all Hasidic groups learn it. Again, in Chabad, they know of him, but I don't know if anybody in there actually learns Kedushas Levi. I've never seen it quoted in any Chabad work whatsoever. I mean, he is mentioned, and stories are mentioned about him, but his work is not, because it's basically the typical work of the other Talmidim for the Maggid. It's basically Torah Baal Shem Tov, Derech Baal Shem Tov. Okay. Another Rebbe of him, somewhat important, is because of his work, not because of the. Now, the Berditchev had some Talmidim, but basically, as a Rebbe with a Chassidus, he wasn't important, although he did influence very many people, many Rebbes at the time. We're going to talk about the Chayz V'Blin. The Chayz V'Blin would pray every day that he thanked Hashem that he was living in a world where the Medici was alive. Pray that thanking Hashem for that he merited to live in the world where the Medici was alive. Okay. The next one is Tzvi Hirsch of Varna. Hirsch of Varna was influential. I think the Mendel Kosovo was influenced by him. The most important from him is he came up with a work called Tzamach Hashem with Tzvi. It is now more of like a specialty thing. It's more of a niche thing. It's not as universally learned, but it's very highly acclaimed. The Chaim of Sanz would say of it that you should sell your boots in order to buy this Tzamach Hashem with Tzvi. Anybody who knows Eastern Europe with the rains and the snows and stuff like that knows that you can't live without your boots there. And he said, no, you should sell your boots just to get this. By the way, I didn't have to sell my boots to get it. I have it here on my shelf here. I don't learn it very much because it's one of the most difficult Chassidic works that's out there. It's very difficult to understand. But again, it's one word. The next one comes from Lutzker. I mentioned him before because he wrote L'Likutei Amorim, Magdav Yankov, the most looked at and used of the works of the Torahs from the Maggid. What's important about him is one of his Talmidim. He was a Rebbe with Chassidim. One of his Talmidim was Rabbi Shulman, a Kayach, who became the Rebbe in Belz. The Belzer dynasty exists until today. Belz is one of the biggest Chassidic groups around. It's not a mega group, but it's one of the large groups of Chassidim. Okay? So the Belzer traces back through Shlomo Lutzker to the Maggid. Okay? The next one is another Rebbe who's more important for the work that he wrote than of himself as far as a Rebbe, is a Feivish of Zabrish. Now, he was a Talmud of three Rebbes, the Rebbe Bear, the Mezrich Maggid, Mechel Zlachova, and Menachem Mendel Primashon, who went to Israel. He quotes them in his book itself. He wrote a work called Yosher Divrei Emes. Now, the importance of Yosher Divrei Emes is it's essentially the first work on Chassidus in general, meaning it's the first work on the Derech of Baal Shem Tov, the Torahs of Baal Shem Tov. He actually quotes something there that's from the Baal Shem Tov that he doesn't quote that it was from the Baal Shem Tov, but we find that in another work. I think in the word Kesser Shem Tov is where it's found. It's a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. This is a fundamental work in Chassidus. Lots of people work word and over. I won't really say that it's universal, but it is a work that people who want to know about Chassidus will learn, because it is basically the Torahs of Baal Shem Tov in the Maggid, what it was in first generations. Again, the Tani is the first work of Chabad Chassidus, telling what Chabad Chassidus is about, and this is the first work really of Chassidus in general. If you learn this work, you basically know where all the Chassidic groups are coming from, where they get their sources, what was done at that time. And the last one among the Talmidim from the Maggid, and he was really also Talmud, I understood he was also Talmud of Baal Shem Tov, also is Yagid Yosef of Ostro. Ostro was a city in Ukraine. And he wrote a work, Yav Yavi, was very well known. He was a very good friend of Mari Magulius. And his work is interesting. He has Torahs on the weekly Parsha. He also brings Torahs from his father on the weekly Parsha. And most interestingly, he writes a commentary on the book of Psalms with Chassidic teachings on every one of the Psalms. It's very, very interesting, very interesting. Again, it's nowadays you consider more of a specialty, a novelty type of work. It's not really, although it's a classic in a sense, it's not something that everybody learns. It's it's out there, but it's not something you hear quoted and seen a lot of times. But if somebody is, like me, for example, who wants to experience and learn the teachings from the earlier generations, what they were like, they learn something like that. But it's not universal. It's just one of these kinds of works that, if you want to, from that time, one of these big Talmidim, from the Baal Shem Tov and Rebbe Bear, you want to see what they thought. It's a work that you would learn, not all the time, but I have it here, but I look into it occasionally when the mood strikes me. Okay, that's the second part. The next part we're going to deal with Melech and his Talmidim, which basically tells us about how Hasidus got to Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So let's just stop a minute, and I will take any question, anything anybody wants to say. No comments, no anything? Okay.
Well, you're giving out a lot of good information, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, the important part of it is I want you to be able to place where Chabad is, for example, in the general picture. Chabad is a group for itself, in many ways separate, just like Breslov is in many ways separate. It's very different from anyone's. There are a lot of things that are missing from them because they did not accept those works that are universal. Much less with Breslov. Breslov is much more attuned to many of these universal concepts than the Baal Shem Tov, but he approaches it in his own way very differently. Whereas Chabad is basically based on Tanya, and Chassidus, as Tanya teaches it, which is that many, many topics which are part of, in general. I mean, I can go through some, for example, the concept of what we call avodah b'gashmi, serving Hashem with physical things, okay? Eating in a holy way, for example. Something that goes back to the Baal Shem Tov, the kavunas of eating from basic Kabbalistic kavunas and applications of such things that are part of everyday life, you know, for the real Chassidim. Remember, you should always remember that by Chassidim, there's really two groups. There is, for a better word, the real Chassidim. The Chassidim are really serious, and the regular people whose concepts of the Chassidus are basically around, you know, concepts of Hashem's, you know, how Hashem's providence deals in the world and stuff like that. Many of these issues, when we talk about theology and Noahides, I'm going to discuss it because my particular view of the world, my particular hashkafa of the world is basically Chassidic, based on Kabbalah. So we will discuss things. I'm not going to give you all the Kabbalistic and Chassidic things of it, but I will give you the ideas where they come from and explanations, so you understand what it is that people believe. And these things, I believe, that is very fundamental for people to know. Somebody asked a question. The Chavetz Chaim. No, Chavetz Chaim is a representative of literature, and specifically the Muslim movement. This is something very different. We have a lot of differences with them. I can put something in my throat for a second.
Rabbi, I have met a Breslov Yidden, and I do notice the distance that they have as opposed to those of Chabad. There's, he literally told me, well, we don't normally get involved.
Right.
And I understood that, right?
Yeah. We're
But
involved
he
in
understood
we're
the
basically
concept.
involved in our communities. I mean, listen, I wouldn't, if it was not for my activities at Counter Mission, I wouldn't be involved either. You know, because again, Noahide laws is a very small area of Torah, and quite frankly, most of the people who are teaching online are not scholars. They don't really learn it. Like right now, I'm going through a review of tractates in Hedron where the main things of the laws are, and sometimes I'll be looking up in other areas in the Talmud where the issue is also discussed, which relates to these things that are important to do it as far as the Jewish law is concerned. Most of the people out there have not really learned as I have. I know Moshe Weiner has, for example, discussed things. Okay, I may disagree with his interpretation, understands things, but I know he has. Okay, as a personal example, because I know I've talked to him now, and I can see from his words. But most of the people who are teaching, and the names that I hear, these are people who have no clue. They may have even learned the Gemara, but they have not learned the other sources on it. They don't know, for example, when we talk about the next section during the Noahide and Tanakh, the issue of learning Torah for Noahides is one of the few issues about Noahide law which actually appears in the responsa literature. And the reason is that it's not just what the Noahides are allowed to learn by themselves, but the discussion of what a Jew is allowed to treat a Noahide. And we're going to learn about this later. I'll explain a little bit more. A Jew is only allowed to teach a Noahide what the Noahide is allowed to learn, and he's allowed to teach what a Noahide is allowed to learn. So it's two things. He's allowed to teach what Noahide is allowed, and he's forbidden to teach what Noahide is not allowed. It's in fact a biblical prohibition for a Jew to teach a Noahide what a Noahide is not allowed to learn. It's biblically forbidden for a Jew to do that. We're going to talk about Noahide and exact, and you know how the Talmud learns that actually from verses, and how the consensus and what we see in the response literature actually understands from this. Okay, but fundamentally, everybody agrees that a Jew is forbidden to teach a Noahide, but a Noahide is not allowed to learn by themselves. It's considered on the same level of a Jew giving to a Noahide a piece of meat that he knows to be torn from a living animal, which is a classic example of what a Jew is not allowed to do, not allowed to give to. Teaching a Noahide what a Noahide is not allowed to learn is prohibited biblically for the Jew. It's a sin for the Jew to do it. So it's important. So most of the people who learn it don't know. Most people don't who learn, say, when it comes to Shabbos, they don't know what the Talmud says about Shabbos. The prohibition for Noahides on Shabbos. They don't understand they don't know where it's coming from. Because they say things that just are stupid, make no sense. I mean, quite frankly,
it's hard enough to learn as a Jew what to do on Shabbos, what not to do, let alone a non-Jew.
They have not learned it, or they misunderstood what they were reading there, but they don't understand what it's saying. And if you look in the Puskim, where they're talking about what they're talking about, it's obvious that I think 90%. I always have this when I speak to somebody. I ask them, why is the Noahide not allowed to keep Shabbos? What does that mean? Where does that come from? What's Talmud talking about that? And the very Muslims don't know what it is. They will give something that's not it. I have found, I was speaking with somebody in Israel recently, who gives talks to Noahides. He actually knew what the answer was, which I was very glad to know, because at least it shows that he's at least learned the subject. He knows something about what's going on. Most of them have no clue. And if you hear him talking about keeping Shabbos, they have no clue about it. No clue what the Talmud actually says. When we talk about religion, Noahides, I'm going to talk about Shabbos. This is a very important thing. Then I'll explain to you exactly what the issue about Shabbos is, what it's really about. Most people know what it is, and all those people go for really weird things. Okay. Anyways, so I do have something for my throat now because I'm getting very dry. So I will be stopping a little bit more to keep my throat from getting dry. If there are any other questions, I will take them. Otherwise, we will go to the third and final part, where we're going to basically see how Hasidus spreads into Poland and also Hungarian Empire. Now, we talked earlier about Rabbi from Łużensk, his work known as Rabbi. The Rabbi, we call him Rabbi from Łużensk. He had four main Talmidim. And these four main Talmidim basically spread Hasidus throughout Poland and Hungary. They come from either from his Talmidim themselves or the Talmidim of his Talmidim. Invariably, they come out from him. He's basically the father of most of the Hasidic groups that are alive today. If you throw out Lubavitch and you throw out Breslov, basically almost every other group that's there, certainly those that are of large size, come out of his students one way or another, or at least had some relationship or revere him in some way. So the first one we have to give basically primacy to is Rabbi Yankov Yosef of Lublin, the Chayz of Lublin. Now, he was a Talmud of the Rabbi Malach of Łużensk, but he was also in Mezrich. Okay, so he was a Talmud in Mezrich. There's an interesting story. It was a Chayz of Lublin because he was a gift of prophecy. When he went to Mezrich, the Chassidim are known for eating together. This is a normal Chassidic practice that on Shabbos, they eat together. So when he went to Mezrich, he went in there and he said that, listen, he had a custom that he would salt his own fish for Shabbos. Now, to meet him, he said, so he went into the kitchen and he took one piece of fish and he salted it, and he went out. And the Chassidim were big. Rabbis, big people saw him and said, what kind of guy, a young guy. So they made a sign on that piece of fish so they could see what happens later on. And true enough, when the meal came around, they were serving out fish, and this piece of fish went to the Chayzer from Lublin. So they realized that he actually could see what was going on in the future. There's wonderful stories about him. I could spend huge amounts of time talking about him. But this is the Chayzer of Lublin. Now, he wrote three Sforim, which are important works, but they really don't have such a large influence. He's mostly important because of his Talmidim, those people who came to him as Rebbe, and what he influenced from them. The three form are called Zichron Zois, Zichron, and Divrei Emes. Not so much important to remember. Very interesting. They are Polish Torahs, meaning that they're short. I mentioned, for example, that Toldos HaKavos is very long, like sermons. There are a number of different Chassidic works are different depending on how the Rebbe taught, and his stuff is very short. Something that's extremely common in by Polish Rebbes. Some Rebbes might be long, but that's very common. Now, among the Hasidim, there were many, many that are important. I'm going to mention the most important ones because these are the ones that are significant for the development of the Hasidic movement throughout the areas of Poland, Galicia, and Hungary. The first one, the primacy has to be given to Yaakov Yosef Pershischa. Now, he had a dynasty after his children became Rebbes, but they were not as important as his main Talmud, Simcha ben Pershischa. Now, he died 1 year before the Choizer died. So he was a Rebbe when the Choizer was a Rebbe also, but he considered the Choizer to be his Rebbe. So this, again, was something very, very common at that time. Later on, it would begin to cause conflicts, but at that time, that was still very common. So when the Yaakov Pershischa died, the Hasidim in general went to his Talmud, Reb Simcha Binim, who became Rebbe Pershischa. He was chosen out. Now, when Simcha Binim died, it was essentially a split. Many of the Talmidim of Simcha Binim became Rebbes in their own right, but essentially there was a split between the two main Rebbes. The first one was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, and the second one was Yitzchak Vorka. Okay? Essentially, the overwhelming majority of Hasidim in Poland trace back to these two rabbis. Now, there's a third rabbi who after the Choizer died, had a much smaller group of people for him. That was the Meir of Apt. He wrote a Sefer Or Lishmaim, one of the more difficult Chassidic for him. Again, it's learned by people who like learning more difficult for him. I've learned it, I haven't. But much smaller group of people with that. The real overwhelming majority were Talmidim from either from Kotsk or from Vorka. Now, before the Second World War, in Poland, there were two mega Chassidices, meaning a huge amount, hundreds of thousands of people who were Chassidim. One was Ger, and the other was Alexander. The Ger Rebbe comes from Kotsk, and the Alexander Rebbe comes from Vorka. Now, after the war, Alexander was wiped out. Like many of the Polish Hasidist groups, and many that I'll even mention now, were totally wiped out of existence. So most of them, we know, there are some descendants here who played with Osman Alexander, but it's very, very small. Their works are learned today. But again, they're not universal types of things. And Kotsk, Ger is now here today. Other groups that came out from Kotsk, from that, are basically non-existent, but Ger is here today. So that's a Pershischa. Now, this third group of Apt, the Meir of Apt, had a Talmud called Shlomo Radomsk. And before the war, Radomsk was a very, very big group. It was totally wiped out in the war. There's no Radomsk Rebbe anymore. But the Radomsk wrote a cipher of his teachings, Tefer Shlomo. Now, his sons and grandsons also had Sforim, but the Radomsk cipher, Tefer Shlomo, is a universal work, meaning it'll be learned by all Hasidim all over. Okay? It's a very fundamental work. In fact, among Hasidic Sforim, it's the first one that I learned from cover to cover. It's a very, very nice cipher. If you live in a Hasidic community and you know what things are like, it's a really easier thing to learn. A very nice cipher, and it's learned by everybody. Now, there's two other Rebbes that were primarily in Lublin. The first one is Tzvi Hirsch of Zidichov. Now, his two brothers were with him there. He was basically the teacher of his brothers also. And he had no sons. He had a son-in-law who was also similar to him, but his brothers had children, and they led to other dynasties. So the dynasties that come down from his descendants, some are by marriage related to him. What makes him important is that the Zidichar was called the Sar Beis HaZohar. He was a prince of the Zohar, meaning that his whole Chassidus was based on the Zohar and Kabbalah. He wrote 2 works, the Teres Svi, which is Kabbalistic explanations of some things on the Zohar, some things on the Harid, the Harizaturia, and some things on the Parshas. And the second work he wrote was called Sermon Av Tov, Turn Away from Evil and Do Good, is a book which teaches an introduction to how to learn Kabbalah. And the Derech of Chassidus is based on Kabbalah. Okay? And again, we'll mention some that come out from him that were related to him. All of these are almost purely Kabbalistic. Their teachings and everything are basically full of Kabbalah. Okay? My son-in-law actually belongs to a Chassidus, which is related. We're going to talk about that next time when we talk about it in groups, which is related to Zidichar. And his Rebbe says a lot of Kabbalah stuff. Because that's where they come from. They're very strongly Kabbalistic. More than any of the Chassidic groups that are around. Much more even than Chabad. Because it's pure Kabbalah. It's not diluted. It's pure Kabbalah, commands from Kavunas, things from the Zohar, pure things like that. And the next one that I want to do, the last one under the Chayza, is Karmas Kalman of Krakow. He also had a relationship between the Pshishcha, of Yankov Yitzchak and Pshishcha, but he was primarily a Talmud by the Chayza. His son was a Rebbe, but he didn't really make a Chassidic group. There's a famous Rebbe who's descended from him. We'll get to mention in a second, because he was also mentioned descended from Koznitz. But he wrote a work called Moav Shemesh. That is also a universal work. A work that's learned in groups that really want to learn about Chassidus. That work basically has all of the primary concepts of Chassidus that exist in that work. It's very common. Now, the second Talmud from the Melech is Yisroel from Koznitz. Koznitz is a city, I think it is in Poland. He was a Polish Chassidus. He did have a dynasty, much more important before the war. There's dynasty of Koznitz. Many people know about it ever from Piaseczna. Shlomo Kabach was very much telling Targum. He wrote a cipher called Aish Kodesh. Very, very popular among a lot of people. Again, it's a very niche type of thing, not learned very much. I mean, people look at it. Aish Kodesh was written when he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was killed during the war. He wrote these down in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he buried it. It was found after the war, brought to his brother in Israel, and was actually printed out. A few things were printed out from him. He has a number of works that are, again, these are more niche type of things, but they're important. He wrote Chayvus HaTalmidim, which is written for boys, actually before the Bar Mitzvah, in order to teach them get introduction to Chassidus. He wrote Hechsheres HaVreichen, which was written for young men who got married. It was never finished, but it's an introduction of what the Chassidic life, how a person, a young married, supposed to live. Very, very important. Okay, but again, Koznitz left. Now, the Koznitz Maggid's son, Moshe, was a son-in-law to the son of Rebbe Melech. So Maidab actually happens to be descended from him. And the Moshe Koznitz's work, he actually likes to learn a lot. And so there are descendants of him, but a Chassidus of itself there's really no remembrance of that Chassidus at all. The third one is Mendel of Rimanov. Mendel of Rimanov was basically Rebbe primarily in Galicia. That's where most of his influence was. He had 2 Talmidim that are very important. Now, when he died, his son didn't take over. He had, it's very difficult. He's like as a janitor attendant. That's who took over. He was a very big tzaddik. He's known for being very tzaddik. And in fact, many of the Rebbes in the next generation who were much greater Talmud scholars would go to him because of his holiness. His name was Shmi Limonov. They're both buried in Limonov. I actually went to Poland once to the grave sites of the tzaddikim. So I remember going to the site. We went in the middle of the night, and there was a non-Jewish guy who watches over the cemetery site. So when we go there, he would say, Hersh to the left, Mendel to the right, because Hersh his grave was on the left side, and Mendel was on the left. They had like a bit of a house built over it, but the left is Hersh. It was very funny the way he looks doing it. But he was his follower, and he was a Rimonov. He also did not really make a dynasty, okay? But he was very important. And Mendel Rimonov was very important because he stamped Hasidus in Galicia, even though the people I'm going to mention now were also in Lublin. They also considered up to meet him in Lublin. But again, at that time, people in that area would actually go to 2 or 3 of the rebels, maybe not 4. Okay, so the first one is Tzvi Elimelech of Dinov. Tzvi Elimelech of Dinov was actually a nephew of Rabbi Melech of Lezhensk. His mother was the sister of Rabbi Melech. His work of most importance. Now, he did start a dynasty which exists today, which we'll talk about next time. He wrote a work called Bnei Yisachar, in which he goes through the whole year and talks about each and every month and each and every holiday month, and explains it based on Kabbalistic and Chassidic ideas and what they're all about. He also has something on the Wicked Parsha, which is also very, very difficult. But this is the most important. He has a few other works also, by the way. One on the mitzvahs, and one just a collection of different types of teachings from various different types of Rebbes that he says over and talks about. But Bnei Yisachar is the main thing, and Bnei Yisachar is basically a universal work. Most places will learn it. One time or another. It may be more common among Polish and Hungarian, but basically it's something that's universal. The next one is Tuli Vdovchitz. He was the rabbi of the city of Vdovchitz. But the Tzvi Elimelech was the rabbi of the city of Dinov. It was the rabbi of the city of Dinov. And the Vdovchitz was the rabbi of the city of Vdovchitz. Okay. Now he went to Koshnitz, he went to Lublin, and he also went to Rimonov. He founded a dynasty of many different groups. The one that's most important as of today was Jacob, and they intermarried a lot with the Vizhnitz. But there were a number of Ropshits. Actually, David Shul Ropshitz, he's descended from the Ropshitz of son-in-law, who became Rebbe in the city after him. His work is called Zera Kodesh, Holy Seed, and it's one of the more difficult Hasidic works. So although it's learned by a lot of people, especially those who are descended from or related to him, a lot of people don't work because of the difficulty of learning it. Importantly, he has a Talmud who's one of the most important Rebbes of that generation, the Chaim of Tzanz. Most of the Rebbes in Galicia and in Hungary were from the students and Talmidim of the Chaim of Tzanz or of his sons. He wrote a work called Divrei Chaim. Again, lots of people learn it. I can't call it universal in the sense I call other works universal. And even the works I call here somewhat universal are really not as universal as others was. Some areas might not look into as much, but Divrei Chaim is considered in Galicia and in Hungary as a fundamental text. And many Hasidic Rebbes nowadays including my Rebbe, are descended from the Chaim of Tzanz. The last one I'm going to cover now is Avram Shia Heschel of Apt. In his later life, he went to live in the city of Mizbez, where the Baal Shem Tov lived, and he was the rabbi of the city. He did have somewhat of a dynasty, but it was a very minor dynasty, and there's no real remembrance of pretty much today. He wrote a work which is fundamental to Chassidus, one of the most difficult works called Ohev Yisrael, the love of Israel, on the Wicked Parsha. It is a very difficult work, very, very Kabbalistically influenced, but it is one of the most fundamental works. Okay, from here, we have basically a foundation to understand all of the Hasidic groups that we will find around today. So in the next session, we're going to actually talk about groups that exist, and we're going to talk about how they link up and a little bit about what differentiates them from each other, how they link up back to these first three generations. But pretty much, I think I've mentioned every single group that's going to be important for when we get to these groups. So by the end of the third, fourth generation, basically all of what in Chassidus you can see today, we can find where they line up there. Okay, that's it for today. I will open it up for questions if there are any general questions out there. And after that, we'll just close the recording. And those people who are on the Zoom session, we can talk for a few minutes also. Dan, any questions out there? Okay, that's good. Certainly we can make suggestions. Of course, as the teacher here, I can, of course, ignore whatever you say, but sure. And I'm almost pretty sure whatever you're going to ask is probably going to be covered under one of the things that I intend to do. Because I have a clear and, pathway of what I'm trying to do. First, we're introducing the concept of rabbis for Noahides, which is fundamental because I blame all the rabbis for most of the problems that Noahides have. So just to be out there. So that's number one. Getting a rabbi and knowing who to have as a rabbi, who to follow and to listen to is extremely important. How to choose that out. I'm actually have to do a review of this to do it. Next section is going to be on the Tanakh and Noahides, the meaning how do Noahides relate to the Torah itself, what they are, why there's certain things about learning, what they should be learning, etc. The next is going to be on theology in Noahides. We are going to deal with the first two mitzvahs, idolatry and not cursing Hashem, which opens us up to the whole concept of theology, belief in God, and certain things like that. So we're going to cover, like, for example, 13 fundamentals and how they will apply to a Noahide. What's required, what's not required, what you should know even if it's not required. The next one will be religion and Noahides, and that deals with the other 5 commandments and also the other things that fill out your life as a Noahide, your religious part of life, your spiritual part of life, where that comes from. We'll discuss about things like prayer. We'll discuss about Shabbos. Obviously, I mentioned that. So, Cookie Monster, if you have a suggestion and it fits in with that, that's fine. If not, what we will do is, if it's really, really interesting, it fits and it doesn't fit into one of these categories, we will just create a new category for it. Okay, Dan, so what's Cookie Monster suggesting?
Oh, it said, they said they're interested in hispodadus, in prayer in general.
Okay,
also,
we are definitely going to discuss about prayer. That's extremely important because that is a spiritual practice that Noahides can do, and I want to instruct in Noahides in a way of prayer that is the best acceptable to them. And again, and part of that is, of course, separating yourself from the kind of paradigm you had as Christians and learning what the Torah is. Hispodadus is a aggressive concept, although it is very similar to the idea of what prayer is supposed to be for a Noahide, and we'll try and get into that. So that will definitely be discussed. It's on the list there. You just have to give me time because I do things very slowly, but it's very methodical, and I'm trying to get through, ideas that will be very helpful and useful to you in a practical manner. Okay.
Right.
A lot of people teach Noahides very theoretical stuff and stuff like that. It's the practical stuff that's very important. You have to know how to live and also to separate yourself from your understanding of how you work. And actually, the one thing about the Chassidic movement that we see here, if you think about it, it's very, very, very different from the Christianity many of you came from, okay? Here we have multiple groups, different ways of serving Hashem, and everyone agrees that everybody else is right also. Everybody agrees that everybody else has a pathway and Hashem accepts them and everything like that, okay? It's different. Even Chabad, which I would consider not strictly following the derech from the Baal Shem Tov, they're following the derech from the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, which is dealing with a more limited scope of the Tina Baal Shem Tov, even that is a valid way of serving Hashem. The thing in Christianity that if you're not the same thing, if you don't dunk the same amount of times, or you don't say this specific thing, you don't do these kinds of things are just not part of Judaism, not part of Hasidus. I mean, there are actually, controversies and rivalries among Hasidic groups and stuff like that. That's human beings are that way. But fundamentally, the concept that somebody say, well, you belong to a different chassid from me, and because of that, you're going to hell because you don't follow my Rebbe, that doesn't exist. In fact, it's very interesting. My Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe I have, I'm on my third Rebbe actually right now. It sounds really strange, but when you get to be older, now my Rebbe is the same age as me, so I don't know. This is probably the last, but the other two were born before the war. So anyways, the Rebbe from my group before the war, whose son became my Rebbe, he once heard one of Chassidim say that this person's Rebbe is nothing. It's nothing. So I told him, you shouldn't say that. Because if you say he's nothing, if you're going to say that I'm 10 times him, 10 times nothing is still nothing. You should say he's a great Rebbe, but my Rebbe is that many times greater than his. Then you said something. You said that his Rebbe is good. But you also said something. You actually praised me out with something like that. But he says he's nothing. 10 times nothing is still nothing. When you say when you degrade, you're degrading your own Rebbe. So everybody thinks his Rebbe is the most important. And the truth of the matter is what the belief of Chassidus has always been, is understood, is that while there is a greatest Rebbe in each generation that people look up to, usually because of how old he is and stuff like that, recognized because of different things, each Rebbe is important for the person because the Rebbe you have has to do with you, is going to complete your soul. Okay? And if you go to a Rebbe who doesn't have the power to complete your soul, then you're going to be wasting your time your whole life, and you will never come to the type of completion that you could go to. So we do, that's why, Chassidim, we don't have to, you're going to hell because, no, each way of serving Hashem is beautiful. It has things in it. I mean, when I was younger, before I was married, sometimes I used to go to all kinds of different Ebbas and see how they did different things. And there were occasionally I would take a custom. So for example, I went to multiple visions of Chassidic. He's no longer died a few years back. I would go to him, and he had a custom before davening. He would say the Tillim for every day, which is something I say, but he would say before davening, and he would walk back and say it with such sweetness. He said it's such sweetness. It's like really went to your soul, the way he would say it, such sweetness. And so when it came to saying the Tillim for the day, I now say it before davening, because that's the way he used to say it. So, it's there's a lot of, some customs you just can't take on. The Lubavitch, they have a wonderful custom that I really love, but it's not the custom in my community. In the Lubavitch, when you read from the Torah, the person's called up, they show him where he's going to start and where he's going to end, and they kiss both places, and then they make the blessing. And afterwards, they show the place where it ended, goes back, and they kiss, and they kiss, their tallis. And we have a different custom what we do as far as that's concerned. That's a beautiful custom. I really love it. It's a very beautiful custom. There's legal reasons, halakha reasons why it is nice. And just in general, it's very beautiful. Clearly where they're to read from. So even if you're not the most knowledgeable person, he shows you where you're going to start and where you're going to end, so you can see what it's a very wonderful custom. But it's just not our custom, that's all. So, they don't think we're going to hell because we don't do it, and I don't think they're going to hell because they do something different from us. That's really what Judaism is about, okay? And that I know is very foreign to people who come out of evangelical Christianity, where, if you say one word different, it's like, oh, well, it's hell for you, okay? That's just not Judaism, okay? That really is not what it is. So what we taught today, Rabbi, also relates that concept. Yes.
Cookie Monster goes on. He says, is it advisable not to be so strict in education if I already have difficulty with the simple things, that I don't have to be too hard on myself, or should I be stricter? And then he goes on and says, or can you just grow with small steps at the time?
Okay, basically it's like this. we're going to talk about it with Torah, but essentially, there is no mitzvah per se for Noahide to learn. What is the obligation for a Noahide is to know what you need to know for your daily life. What you're supposed to do. What are you allowed to do in your daily life? How these apply to your daily life practically. And when we talk about religion and Noahide, we're going to go through the commandments and talk about really practical things in daily life. For example, very simple thing. You go into a store, and there used to at least be the custom of, tasting the fruit. You see a bunch of grapes, so you taste one grape to make sure the grapes are okay, whatever. I remember when I was younger, people would talk, well, that's a problem with the Noahide laws. Unless you know that the owner allows it, that's basically theft. In fact, there's a medrash talking about in the city of Sodom, that's exactly what they used to do. Everybody used to go into the store, and they would only taste one grape or one thing like that, and afterwards there'd be no grapes left over. They eat out of the store because it's just a small whatever. No, a Noahide has to be careful about such things. So if you want to taste a fruit or something like that, you have to ask them, am I allowed to taste? And if they give you the permission to taste and see if it's good, then you can. If you can, you just have to try and feel it and see if you can figure out if it's good or not. Okay, that's a practical thing about Noahide law that you should know about. And again, remember, if you know the general rules, but you don't know some of these specifics, the Rambam says that the concept of unintentional sin does apply to Noahides also, except for a general. I mean, you can't say that I didn't know murder wasn't allowed. I can't even say that wasn't allowed. But you may not know that certain conditions of, when you're allowed to take somebody's life when they're trying to attack you, for example. We're talking about such these things that are somewhat different. Okay, it's not, if it's genuinely that the thing is forbidden, but just know this particular type of thing is not forbidden. That there's the punishment doesn't from that, but of course you're supposed to learn what you're supposed to do, and so we're going to discuss it for them. The practical things are what's important. Okay, so as far as learning, you have to learn what's the practical stuff, and you will obviously be learning more and more about things that practically have to do with questions you might have. That's why you have rabbis here. Okay, I go to rabbis when I have to ask a question. You should be going to a rabbi also. If you have a question, does this apply? I get emails all the time whether this applies to certain things or not. Sometimes I'll answer just yes or no, and sometimes I'll explain why it is. Okay, but you have to sometimes ask a rabbi, is this covered under is this actually forbidden because of this? And you have to know that's what rabbis are supposed to be for. And if you have somebody who's teaching you and he's not qualified, then his teaching might be good, but you really need to have somebody who could actually instruct you on the practical things of what you're supposed to do. That's extremely important. And there are books out there, of course, but books are not sufficient. And it's very important to recognize that if you think reading a book is going to tell you everything you need to know, that's just because that's a Christian paradigm that you had. That's not what it is. It's not the Jewish paradigm. The Jewish paradigm is when you have questions, you go to somebody else. You don't try and figure it out on you. You go to somebody else, and even if you think, well, I'm pretty sure that's what it means, but let me just check it out with somebody to make sure that that's really what it means, then you ask a question about it. Unless you're 100% sure of what the implications of what you read, you just ask a question about it. And those people who are teaching should be qualified to be able to answer. If they can't answer immediately, say, oh, let me get back to it. I just want to double check on something like that. Because sometimes sometimes you get asked questions that are not so straightforward, and you have to look at a couple of sources to say, okay, this is a little bit interesting. Okay. Questions like you're allowed to eat meat out of a store, for example. Do you have to worry about Avim and Achai, from the store that you buy from the store? What's the question about that? Okay, I'll discuss this later. I'm not going to discuss this now because I don't want to get into all kinds. Because then you can just start bombarding me with questions, and I don't want to do it without just reviewing this stuff before I do it. Because you're supposed to review things before you do it. Sometimes you might remember something. So before I do it, I'll review it. But these are important questions. Okay, and that's why you have rabbis. If you don't know, you ask a rabbi. There's nothing wrong about that. It's it's just common. Again, that's something that is different in the Jewish paradigm, the Torah paradigm, than it is in the Christian paradigm. The Christian paradigm is, either you are imbued by the Holy Spirit or your pastor is imbued by the Holy Spirit. But the fact that you might have to actually, speak to somebody who might know more than you, it's nothing that doesn't even come into the imagination. Okay, but that's really what the Torah is. The Torah is a recognition that there are people that have to go there. I mean, again, that was one of the points in the book of Exodus that I pointed out before, that Moshe was choosing out leaders of 50, and these are the people that you go to ask questions, right? Because you go to people, authorities more knowledgeable, and everybody might have to go to somebody more knowledgeable. So when they say, and something that's too hard, you come to him. Meaning that if it's something, you just go up the chain. And many of the responsive literature you find is basically people went up the chain. A rabbi was asked a question, he couldn't answer it, so he wrote to another rabbi who was much bigger scholar than him and asked this question. The responsive of Moshe Feinstein are filled not with questions that were answered by his congregants, were asked by other rabbis, how do you deal with this issue? What am I supposed to do with it? So for example, one of the, I was talking about, the discussion of what you're supposed to teach with Noahide, which basically is what the Noahides are about to learn. There's response about that, on that issue of teaching non-Jews. It comes up in a number of instances. When we talk about it, we'll talk about how it comes up. But the question comes up, and the question was not asked by a lay person, it was asked by another rabbi, because he himself did not feel he knew it. So he asked another rabbi who was greater than him. This is so fundamental to the Torah way of life, but it's so totally contrary to what evangelical Christianity is about. The recognition that there are some people who know more than you, and you act only on how much you know. If you don't know, there's no shame in not knowing. You just go to somebody who knows more than you. That's all. There's a lot to learn, and you just recognize, oh, there's just limitations. Question was asked, how well should I know the details of the 7 commandments? You need to know practically to live your day-to-day life. You do not have to know, like I do, all the arguments in the Gemara back and forth, what the commentaries say on it, how they answer, what ends up in response, it's everything. You need to know only the answers at the end. What is a final decision on it? Okay? The Talmud is very difficult because you find, and commentaries also say, you find the Talmud will discuss a view of a rabbi for a page or two, and then at the end says, we don't follow this. It's better the other view that we heard from the other rabbi in the beginning. So you've got 2 pages of Talmud about something that has absolutely no practical value at all, because we just don't follow this view. They argue out the whole view. What are the implications, everything like that? And then said, well, we just don't follow this view. We follow the other rabbi at the beginning. But that's the way the Talmud is about. So learning inside the text is really more confusing. We're going to discuss why we talk about Talmud, but one of the reasons why is because it's just more confusing. It confuses you more than clarify. And part of following the law is you need clarification. What am I supposed to do practically? Okay, what am I supposed to do when I go to a store? When I go to this, how am I storing my? If you're in business, how you have to know those things that are practical to you. That's what you have to know. And again, if you don't know, you just ask. It really isn't. You just ask.
So is that like basically saying, hey, I got 7 laws here. One of them says don't kill nobody. I don't kill anybody. So that's practical.
Yeah, but okay. What happens if you're okay? I'll give you a couple of answers. I'm not going to answer this yet now because I'll answer it later because I have to double check my sources on. What happens if you are in the army and sent to a country and you're in a war zone? Are you allowed to kill people there? We'll discuss it later. I just want to throw this out to you. What happens if somebody's coming to your house and they have a gun? Are you allowed to shoot them? Is that considered murder? Okay. These are legitimate questions. They're practical. Okay. The things that, we will discuss them on the religion Noahides. We'll discuss about murder, what it is, with the eye towards what's practical, not theoretical. All these theoretical arguments are really, I've seen too many discussions of theoretical arguments which actually confuse Noahides rather than clarify the situation. So we're going to deal practically. What am I supposed to do? What do I have to know? What am I supposed to worry about? What am I supposed to do? Okay. And you have to remember, Jewish people are the same thing. With Jewish people, we pray a little in the morning and then we go about our lives in our business. Very few people, you get a very, mistaken idea. Very few people are teachers in yeshivas and stuff like that. Okay. Very few people are scholars among the Jewish people. That's why scholars are so prized, because of the knowledge, because there's very few of them, really. Okay. Most of you live our lives. And if you look back into the Torah, that's really what it was. The Jewish people were given the Torah. And so what they were told to go, they went into the land of Israel. And what did they do? They didn't start sitting in synagogues all day long. They didn't sit down. They went out to the fields and they worked. In Babylonia, twice a year, between the seasons, they would come together in order to have what's called the Yer Chakala. It was a couple of weeks where they would learn Torah with the rabbis who were learning the whole year. Then they'd go back to the work in the fields. That's what life was about, okay? Living a life normally in this world. That's, as a Noahide, it's no different. Your life is make money for your family and do whatever you have to do. When you make money, you can give charity. We'll discuss the concepts of charity. Again, we'll deal about religion in Noahides. That's part of the commandments. Charity is also something Noahides should be doing. We'll talk about a lot of these things, but basically, being a Noahide is you live a normal life, okay? You just live a normal life. You get up in the morning, you do your work, you get married, you and your wife live together, she makes meals. If she burns your meal, you don't scream at her, all kinds of things you have to learn. This is part of the character traits that you have to learn also. But these kinds of things, this is what it's about. It's living normal, You want to be a normal Noahide, okay? You want to be a normal guy. You got a 9-to-5 job or whatever your job is, whatever. Within what the Noahide laws tells you, you're allowed to do, or you're not allowed to do, what you should be doing, what you're not supposed to do. That's really, what the goal is for Noahide. You learn what you need to know. You don't need to know, to be sitting when there are a lot of people that every time I quote something, they say, well, the Talmud says here. Don't call me the Talmud. I've already learned that stuff. It doesn't make a difference what the Talmud arguments are going on. The question is, what was the result for the argument? What is if it's something that in the responsive, like for example, learning Torah, which isn't the responsive, what do they say in the end is what we're supposed to do? What is the final conclusions about it? What have the rabbis in the most recent generations, looking back at it, what have they said we're supposed to do? That's what you do. That's what you do as a Jew. That's what happens with us. The same thing. We know of all the arguments, but when you look at what to do, you look in the latest things, the latest responsive, where the questions were asked specifically, and that's how you do. That's what the things are like. And so we'll deal with these kinds of issues. The main thing is that it's important to keep it as simple and as clear and as practical as possible. Okay? Because there is no, like for me, there's a commandment for me to learn anything. I learn all kinds of stuff which is totally not relevant. There's tractates in the Talmud that we learn, tractates about sacrifices that we're not going to do, unless Mashiach comes today or tomorrow, we're not going to be giving sacrifices. And these are totally theoretical things. Okay? And there's lots of things about that that are totally theoretical. There's a tractate called Soita, which is the woman who's found in idolatry, which the Talmud itself said never happened. No woman ever had to, this is something that never happened. It's just totally theoretical. The whole tractate on things that are totally theoretical. Not the whole tractate, because actually the last chapter deals with things that are very practical. The blessings of Kohen and other things as far as what's considered English one other language. It's practical. But the most of it's about stuff that really has no relevance to real life whatsoever. But it's a commandment for me. Every word I learn of it, even though it's totally irrelevant to my life, it's a commandment. For Noahide, it's not the same. Noahide, your obligation is to learn what you need to know in a practical manner for your life. Okay? And we'll discuss things like that when we talk about Torah. Those things that are definitely considered practical. And those things, not really practical. Some of those things are actually forbidden. It's an important subject, and again, that's what the next unit is going to cover. First, the next unit is going to cover about what the Tanakh is itself, the Jewish Bible. We'll go through each book, everything like that, and then we're going to discuss about how, as a Noahide, you should relate to it, what you should be getting out of it. Because remember, as Noahides, your ancestors did not come out of Egypt, okay? Your ancestors were not involved in the conquering of the land of Israel. Okay, Isaiah did not come to your ancestors. He came to the Jewish people and was speaking to them. So what are you going to get out of reading it? Okay. Now it's clear in the next unit, we're going to find out that the overwhelming majority of views say that Noahides are allowed to learn all of Tanakh. There is a view that prohibits learning the Torah. We can talk about why that is, but essentially the overwhelming view is that Noahides are allowed to learn Tanakh. So that's fine, you can learn Tanakh, but the question is, okay, now I'm reading Tanakh. What does it have to do with me? What can I gain from it? Where's the relevance to me? Okay, and that's one thing that you don't hear people talking about. I want to delve into that subject. What is the what's the relevance to you as a Noahide? All this story about the history of the Jewish people, what does that have to do with you? Why, I mean, it's nice, it's history, but why is that more interesting to you than history of China or the history of the Roman Empire? What makes it, important, something that you really feel a draw, you want to read? What is it that you're going to get out of reading? Okay. And that's very important. And so we're going to cover that in the next time. Okay. I don't want to answer it now because then you're not going to come. I want you to come. If you don't come, then there's no going to be here to listen to it. So next time when we get to the next unit, we're going to discuss it. But first you have to know what the Tanakh really is. Most Christians have no clue what the Tanakh really is. Okay. Most Christians have the view that sometime in the distant past, God faxed down the books that he wanted to be put together in the Bible. And these are the inerrant word of God, and everybody's supposed to follow it, and everything you need to know in your life is there. That's basically Christianity in a nutshell. It's not what it's about. Okay, from beginning to end, that's all a bunch of hooey. I like that word hooey, it's really nice. A bunch of hooey, okay? It's not, there's nothing to it. Okay, and we're going to discuss about it, and then we're going to give you the proper way of understanding from a Torah perspective what the Tanakh is. And as you as a Noahide being not Jewish, me as a Jewish person, I get different things out of the Tanakh than you will. But what can you get out of it? What is it there for you? Why is it something that you should you can learn? What can you learn out of it? Okay, so that's what's going to be the next unit we're going to talk about. That's going to be a fun unit. A lot of controversy, of course, but of course it's very important because one thing that I know about all Noahides, they all want to read the Bible. They want to read Jewish Bible. They feel because as Christians, it was like the number one mitzvah that they had is to read the Bible every week and go to Bible study. So they feel they take it on, and it's really not that way. But still, it's something that you can do. But I want to give you the proper perspective on how to do it. Somebody asked a question. I've learned a lot of Lashon. It helps me when I'm dealing with people. Learned a lot has and able to refine my speech. Okay, we will talk about Lashon Hara. Strictly speaking, there's no prohibition of a Noahide speaking Lashon Hara. Having said that, one of the things which we talk about when we talk about religion Noahides is the fact of perfecting your character traits as a human being, to live a life that shows that you recognize there's a God in the world and that you are held to a certain standard, even though it's not obligatory, but there's certain things that you should be doing because, that's just the proper way of doing things. Okay. Lashon Hara is that. But there's a whole bunch of speech, okay? I would just give one of the Chassidic, one of the complaints that we have about the obsession with Lashon Hara is very simple. Number one, it's impossible not to say Lashon Hara sometime or another. Number two is when you concentrate on Lashon Hara, it leaves out, and in many times makes you violate other types of speech which is forbidden. Okay, and we'll talk about forbidden speech, and at the end of a word called Shara Tshuva talks about 4 types of speech which is forbidden, and these are very important. Although it may not necessarily apply to Noahide specifically, but it's certainly something Noahide should do because they're proper ways of speaking. It makes sense. I'd say it's something that's logical. I don't like using the word logical because logical is very difficult to define. It is, but it certainly is a type of life. And if you're interested in Lashon Hara, these things are as important as again, we'll get to that with religion. I can get up on subjects that we can talk about for hours. So it's not that. Lou, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about Noahideism in general. Is there any history or any time period where the teaching of Noahideism was more popular, like maybe a few hundred years ago? Or
answer is no. Okay. Now that does not mean that occasionally people would ask. For example, we know the Chedul, Azulai, on one of his trips to Italy, he met up with a non-Jewish person who apparently seemed to be more of a humanist rather than a Catholic, and they had a discussion. And so he talked with him, and he saw that he didn't believe in Christianity. So he explained to him that Judaism holds that you should keep the 7 laws. He told him what they were, and that you should believe in one God only, not in God as a unity, not as a Trinity, and that you should say the Shema every day, saying that you believe in one God.
The reason I The reason I asked that is because there's a very
Let me
famous.
try, let me finish, okay, because we don't really see this, okay? There have been some things, I won't mention the rabbi's name, somebody who's basically off the wall who tried to make Noahidism a universal type thing, but his stuff was not even based on Jewish law. It was based on its own humanistic ideas. Okay, it's not based. There is Jewish law, and Noahides are bound, according to the Rambam. The Noahides today basically consider them as Noahide based on what the Rambam says, that you do it because the Torah says to do so, which means that you are following it because of the Torah. To be a true Noahide who's assured of the world to come, it's only if you're doing because of the Torah. Now, whether other people aren't doing because of whatever, what's going to happen with those, these are all difficult philosophical questions that we don't necessarily have the answer. We know Hashem is merciful, and he knows what's in the heart, so he might judge the people. We're talking about people, anybody who's coming to classes on Noahide. Noahide law is somebody who wants to do what the Torah says for him to do, him or her to do. Okay, as being said, that's what the standard is. So those people who did before, like for example, this Ben Bagazi, I think was his name, whatever, who tried to come up with something. It was just not based on Torah. It was based on philosophical ideas. Yet many times it would contrary to the Torah, what the Torah teaches us Hulchim and Noahides. So it's very important to know that. So essentially, until recently, there was none. And even when the Noahide movement started, it really was not really as strongly bound to Torah law as it should have been. I think Devon Code did a lot to help that. I think Rabbi Blumenstiel tried to do a lot to help with it, but he's very unhappy with what's happened with his works because they've been misused and misunderstood. So there have been things that have tried to get Noahides to understand that, yes, when we say that it has to be according to the Torah to be assured of a place in the world to come, according to the Rambam, that's what it means. So you have to know what the Torah says, not go, what you feel. Torah doesn't care about your feelings, okay? It cares about what the Torah says. You're supposed to feel what the Torah says you're supposed to feel, not you feel something and say, oh, the Torah's got to accept what I feel. It's the other way around. What the Torah says is that's how you're supposed to feel, okay? It's the exact opposite. When we talk about theology, we talked about, I'm going to bring you some philosophical topics which give you a certain way of understanding the Torah view of such things. But again, the bottom line is no, until recently there hasn't been. And I would even say that the beginning of the modern Noahide movement was also in many ways not on the right track. I met many people who were there from the beginning who basically did not have people guiding them according to the Torah, according to what the Jewish law actually says about these issues. They were basically winging it. It says in a verse something like that, so they say they'll bring things from verses. We don't rule halachic issues based on what a verse says. The verses have to be understood what the rabbis teach us it means, and then if it has a halachic implication, we follow from there. We don't just read a text and say, oh, the verse says this, so it means something. Okay, that's not what it means. It means what the tradition tells us that means, and then that's where we take them. Otherwise, you're not being a Noahide according to what the Torah teaches. You're being a Noahide according to what you want it to mean. You're basically being an evangelical Christian who wants to define Noahidism based on evangelical Christianity's paradigm. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to deal against. Because listen, you're approaching this as an evangelical. You're not approaching it as a Torah. Okay? And that's fundamental what I'm trying to teach. And pretty much everybody that I know who I've talked to about it, they agree with me. They may not disagree that I follow with Moshe and the way that I approach halacha and what I whatever, but which I'm very open about how I get to my what I say, who I'm following, what it is. But this fundamental concept that we're seeing that actually what's happening is the Noahides who we're seeing are basically being Christians. They don't understand what Torah is trying to say. So so that's it. Most of the stuff that's been done today has been very difficult. And really, a lot of people are supporting what I'm trying to do. I was recently in Israel, and Rabbi Goldberg, they asked me if I would be willing to give talks on this subject to his people, to Noahide groups or something like that. It's something in the web. Maybe it'll happen sometime. But, there's a recognition of what I'm talking about, these ideas of how to look at what it means to be a Noahide, not from the Christian eyes you had before, from a Torah perspective. It is extremely important. And other things that people mostly argue about are less important than that. Once you do this, many, many, many of the things where we disagree about won't even exist because the questions won't even come up. Yeah, Aaron, I see you. I see your hand. Aaron.
Yeah, there's a lot of different groups we have to encounter as Noahides, and not just Christians, but Muslims as well as Hebrew Israelites. So, we kind of sometimes get surrounded by different ideas that try to change portions of the Torah for us, and we still have to maintain it in those environments as well.
Yeah, again, but if you keep your eye on the ball, what's the eye on the ball? Being a Noahide means that you're following the commands because it's Torah. Right. You're not doing it because you like it. You're not doing it because, okay, I read the Bible and that's what seems to, no, that's not being a Noahide. Being a Noahide is essentially, in the modern sense of the term, okay, means you're doing it because that's what God wants you to do. And how do you know what God wants you to do? Because it's Torah. The Torah way is you have people if you don't know what to do, you come to authority and ask him. You don't pray to Hashem that you should understand. I've always asked the evangelicals, okay, you say you pray to Hashem, to God, that he should answer you. How do you know it's not Satan answering you? It's trying to, fool you, get you farther and farther from God rather than getting you closer and closer to God. He can give you the same feelings. How do you know that's not what it is? Because you don't. Okay? So, anyways, that's what it is.
Rabbi, that's a
Dan,
good. Do you mind if I check out and wind it down on the broadcast?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, see if there's any more questions. I mean, those people in the Zoom group, we have private things we can keep talking, but everybody else.
Yeah, nothing major. Cookie Monster had a few more comments, but nothing too serious.
I hope they're all good.
Yeah, they're all good. It looks like we hit about 235 live views so far. So, yeah, I got to wind it down. My wife's been cooking for the last hour. So, on that note, I want to thank you, Rabbi. And I guess, are we still aiming for the end of January for our next session?
Yeah, I'm going to look at my calendar, look at it, because I want to finish this thing up. There's no preparation. The next one will take preparation. I don't know how long it's going to take me to do it, because I got a lot of projects working at the same time. But we'll see about that. Do you want to give it to Ronald to close it down? Because I'll see if any of these people.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna wind it down on.
First, shut off everybody else, then give it over to Ronald.
All right, folks. That's going to be our Noahide Path with Rabbi Moshe Shulman for today. Excellent topic. It's always more enjoyable when we get people in the Zoom room and good questions. I appreciate some of the regulars asking questions, even on YouTube and Facebook. Always good to see new people as well. Such a joy. So we're aiming for the end of January, but we will let you know. So keep an eye out for the posts. And until then, have a wonderful month. Bye for now.